What's up everyone, All Trades Jack here. Hope you're excited for Exile Con coming up pretty soon. I know I'm excited to see what else they want to reveal for PoE 2 and hopefully a good reveal for the next season coming in a month. Today, out of appreciation for all of your support this past year, I wanted to make a quick compilation video with some new commentary because I have received comments, emails, and messages asking about different parts of my PoE videos or about my PoE journey in general. I've realized that a lot of the questions come about because it's been over a year since I've posted my first Path of Exile video, and I've obviously learned a lot since then. I now have 7 more videos, 8 in total, about 500 to 600 hours of game time under my belt. Depending on which video you see first, you're probably catching me at very different points in my PoE career. So this video is going to be a compilation of all the Path of Exile videos I've created so far on my journey to review the entire game. Keyword, so far, because my journey is far from over. For all the people new to my channel, the Committee of Casuals playlist is still up, where you can find all the original videos, but this compilation is for you to watch them all in one place in consecutive order. For all of you returning viewers, I'm going to be adding a section at the end of each episode where I'll add some commentary on my journey and the episode itself, now that I understand so much more about the game. Hopefully you'll enjoy following along and realize, like I have, that I wasn't stupid, I was just a little naive when I started playing Path of Exile as a new player. I'll put in chapters, of course, so you can skip to the commentary sections if that's what you're here for. Anyway, I won't draw this intro out any longer. Hope you continue to enjoy the series, and once again, I want to say thank you for all the support that you've given me this past year. This community is filled with so many passionate players, but most if not all of you have been so welcoming and nice in your critiques, so much so that I've continued to create Path of Exile content just out of excitement of getting to hear your opinions. So thank you one more time, and let's get started. The past couple of years have been hectic as all hell, so no one would blame you for wanting to escape reality and dive into a new one. But with so many options to choose from, how will you know which one to start with? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a casual review, a series where I spend the time to test and review popular games so you can decide if you want to try them out. In this video, I will be diving into the popular MMORPG Path of Exile and analyze the experience a new player would have if they were to pick up the game today. Path of Exile is on Steam and has a very respectable player base of about 30,000 daily players, and seems to be on the rise. It is free to play with many free mini expansions that have come out since they launched in 2013, so that's a pretty good start already. A quick note before we begin. I did not get to max level to review the new player experience. I've put in about 30 hours of playing before writing the review and have detailed out my thoughts. There may be things I don't cover, like max level content, but I've done my best throughout my playthrough to take part in anything that seemed accessible to new players as they progress through the game. With that said, let's begin. First, let's talk a bit about Path of Exile's gameplay design. Path of Exile, or PoE, is an MMORPG in the same kind of way that Diablo or Warframe is. You build your character, jump into a world that other players are in as well, but anything done outside of a town or sanctuary is done only by your party, so either alone or with whoever you group up with. This has some positives and negatives, but to me, it makes you think of the game as more of a single-player game with multiplayer functionality, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I've played other games like this and it definitely works. You can still trade and group up with other players, you can take part in instanced PvP content, you at all times are connected to others through world chat, so you're never truly alone, you just won't see other people fighting alongside you unless you find friends. You kinda have to go into the game with that understanding though, or you will definitely feel extremely alone in the dark and twisted fantasy setting that the game has you explore in. As for gameplay, the camera is set in an overhead semi-isometric view, and you move by clicking around. Holding down the left mouse button will have your character continuously move to follow it. I don't really mind this. Click to move is not a bad thing, especially for ARPGs, but I do wish I had more of an option to zoom out. It was pretty disorienting at first to be so close to my character. I found myself constantly trying to spin my mouse wheel back so that I could see more of what was around me. Though playing for a while, I eventually got used to it, and sort of enjoyed the amount of action I was able to see by being so close. This is a graphically impressive game, and the combat animations are no exception. Combat is probably the highlight for me. At first it's a left-click marathon, then a left and right-click marathon, but eventually you can build yourself into having 8 different spells and 5 flasks hotkeyed onto your action bar, and you will be using all of them. The combat is extremely fluid for the most part, the only downside being that my tiny brain had to get used to the fact that if I kept mashing the left mouse button, my character would end up sprinting around and cancelling spells. I got better eventually, but having to click for every attack was something I definitely had to get used to. But overall, you can feel the weight of your attacks. Every spell has an animation that can change if you apply a support gem to it, and every character can use every spell, assuming you are using the right weapon and have a gem slot open for it, which is a very good way of allowing for individual character customization, which this game has a lot of. Each level you reach, you are rewarded with a passive skill point, which can be applied to the passive skill tree, which is f***ing insane. The skill tree has more options than I would ever try to understand. You have to zoom out to see it all, and there's a damn search function on it. This is terrible for new players. It is daunting as all hell to see that many options and be expected to apply one point at a time. This is probably where PoE loses many of its new players, but assuming you don't quit or just look up a cool meta build, exploring your options can be extremely entertaining. Having this many branching paths of progression allows for each player to create their character in exactly the image they have in their mind. I love this part of the game. However, if you get far enough and try to take part in the endgame content, I could see how the illusion of choice starts to set in. Where there is a world of options to casual or individual players, as soon as you join top tier content, you will be exposed to the pressure of following the meta, which I am sure means that there are specific builds that you are going to be told to talent into. That would leave 90% of this awesome skill tree completely ignored. For new players, PvE is really your only option. I tried to access PvP, but well, I decided I would try again when I was older. So PvE is your goal in order to level up and complete the story, and I think Path of Exile does pretty well with this. It's very linear as MMOs go, so you won't have a great sense of world size, and you will always know that eventually you have to move forward. The story is pretty good as MMO stories go, but the highlight is the ambience and amazing combat, with hordes of enemies establishing a sense of urgency and achievement when you complete a quest or get new gear. And gear is everywhere. Enemies drop gear. There is gear in chests and barrels throughout every zone, and you can even look inside dead bodies or rocks for some. There are also empowered enemies throughout each zone, which gives some engaging combat and a chance at better gear, so exploration is definitely encouraged. The main quest is easy to follow and provides a compelling reason to go smash enemies and dungeon dive. The side quests are not exactly plentiful, but they do add some extra events to the linear zone that you'll be traveling through. Questing never really felt like a chore, but instead was a reason to move forward in the story and traverse the world while you were at it. There are also small dungeons and extra events that are littered throughout the different zones, so if you take the time to explore, you will be rewarded with cool new bosses or events that give cool upgrades. The interface is clean and helpful. You have your standard minimap and quest list on the side of your screen, with spells, mana, and health lining the bottom of your screen. The system interfaces are a little too detailed for players that have no prior experience with the game, but that's not really an issue with the interface, and rather just an issue with new player education on gameplay systems. Really the only issue I have with the UI is the full-size map. If you press tab, you bring up a larger map overlay that is transparent and sits over your screen. You can move this overlay around with the arrow keys, but for larger maps, it's pretty clunky. Not to mention the fact that you are constantly bringing it up, since the minimap is not at all helpful in figuring out where you are going. I found myself playing half the game with a map overlay blocking the majority of my view, even during combat. I would just engage with the enemies, forgetting that it was even there. But now that we have discussed the general gameplay for Path of Exile, let's take a look at your first steps within the game. You start the game how every MMORPG begins, creating a character. The first screen you are brought to presents a cool feature that allows you to choose what type of game mode you would like to try. I'm sure for longtime veterans of the game, the League play is a welcome option. This allows you to play a character for a specific amount of time and try to accomplish everything you can during a single season. At the end of the current season, a new league begins and you start a fresh new character. That's a basic overview as to how it works, but since I'm a completely new player, I'll start with the standard league. After choosing your league, you choose your class. You can choose any of the 5 preset classes, but because of the skill tree I mentioned, there is a metric ton of class specialization paths you can choose. Choosing your class here affects where you start on the passive skill tree, but not where you'll end up. I went ahead and tried all of the classes at least to level 5, so I will give my initial thoughts quickly. The Templar is a spellcaster and melee class that can excel in either one. They start with a scepter for enhancing their spells, but you can switch to a melee weapon if you decide you want to build an in-your-face holy brawler. I chose to build the beginnings of a shaman-like character by enhancing my elemental spellcasting, and by level 5, I was pretty into it. Lots of damage, lots of burst AoE, and single target spells. And if I played any further, potential for some cool totems that enhance your abilities or act as minions for you. The Shadow is basically a rogue, but with a cool serial killer twist to it. Not that serial killers are cool, but just different than the basic rogue. He starts with daggers, but excels in all one-handed combat. I chose to use claw weapons and build his attack speed just to see how fast I could make his hands, especially because his poisons were so damn powerful already. The Marauder is a warrior giant and excels in one-handed or two-handed melee combat. He is your basic warrior that any game has, but damn does it feel good to smack enemies with two-handed weapons. He also doubles as a tanky character, so I basically gave him a two-handed axe, a bunch of life-stealing AoE skills, and took down hordes of enemies just by standing still. There's probably a lot of depth to his play, I'm sure, but this has been working for me so far. The Ranger is your bow user with plenty of abilities to shoot many arrows. The skills are powerful and provide a lot of mobility, so your gameplay is shoot and move. The Ranger is very similar to how bow classes function in other MMOs, but because of the talent tree, you also have the ability to harness your attunement with nature and become more of a druidic character, with poisons and animal spirits lending you their power. So a lot more depth if you decide to drop the basic hunter role. The Duelist is your quick-witted arena competitor who uses rapiers or other one-handed weapons to dip in and out of close-range combat with enemies. With this class, you can either build into a more tanky dueler with more health and better blocking, or you can lean into your evasion and be a shifty fencing-type dueler. This class has a lot of quick movement and bleed abilities either way, so mobility is definitely a strong suit. My favorite part of the Duelist so far is the Splitting Steel spell, which shoots pieces of broken swords at enemies from a distance. It's pretty badass for a low-level spell. Finally, the Witch is your basic mage or spellcaster. She has a high spell damage and mana pool to be able to shoot off multiple spells at high intensity, but she'll die if one of the enemies gets too close to her. The main attraction for this class is the amount of variety when it comes to which school of magic you're going to specialize in. So far I've used ice, fire, arcane, and summoning spells, with summoning being my favorite. I basically was able to summon a small undead army to do all the fighting for me, while I took cheap shots at enemies from a distance. So once you have chosen your class and a name, you jump right into the game. There isn't any character creation or visual options in the game. The majority of that comes with in-game armor, making your character look different than others. I really wish we had some options though. I really wanted to be a mage that didn't sound or look like a little evil witch girl, or be a Templar that wasn't way past his prime already, but that is part of the game, being lore-rich and more story-driven. The tutorial starts with you already shipwrecked on an island, and the very basic aspects of the gameplay are taught to you as you navigate the beach. You are taught to explore and fight enemies. The game shows you how to equip spell gems and support gems, and you fight your first boss. Not too bad as tutorials go, but that is all that is explained to you. The talent tree isn't explained all that much, and none of the stats or gameplay systems are explained at all. And this is a problem, because as you go on in the game, you realize that you are affected by a lot of these systems, but don't really know how or why. The only reason I was able to figure it out was because I spent time going through these display texts, and I have a background in MMOs and tabletop RPGs, but there's a lot I still don't understand. I'm sure that a lot of players are going to say, oh, the game just doesn't handhold you, tutorials aren't supposed to explain everything, and you're right, to a certain extent. MMOs are giant games, with so many different systems and features that are all learned through long hours of gameplay. If the game doesn't do a good job of introducing new players to these features, many of those new players won't engage in them, and this game is very complicated. With all the character customization options the game gives you, it brings along a load of different stats, spells, items, and combat styles that a new player just wouldn't understand. It's not that they can't learn, it's just that many new players won't want to. Moving on. You are brought into the first town, which is this little outpost, and the first thing I thought to myself is, wow, cool atmosphere, every NPC is voice acted, and the music sounds like it's straight from The Witcher. Not bad. And that'll be a theme as you play the game from here on out. Every quest is fun to complete because it's engaging and has a story along with it. The zones you will be in are detailed and the enemies are varied. There are small bosses everywhere and large bosses at the end of quests, and the music and voice acting do very well to tie the journey all together and provide a great sense of immersion. At one point, you are sent into a cave to kill a siren, and not only was the combat really difficult and engaging, but the siren was whispering to me during the entirety of the maze before the battle. And these spectral ghost women thingies kept appearing in front of me, beckoning me to keep going deeper into the cave. It genuinely disturbed me a bit. As you progress in the game, the difficulty increases pretty quickly, to a point where if you don't know what you're doing, you will die a couple times. The combat starts to really become a balance of how much damage you are doing and taking, and making sure you're drinking your health potions at all times. The best part about dying is that you can choose to respawn instantly, and it sends you back to a checkpoint. So if you happen to be in a cave and die to a siren boss, for example, the game will allow you, with each of your 15 deaths, to respawn just outside the entrance and rush back in to engage the boss again. The combat never stops, and if you try again within 10 minutes, the boss actually won't reset, so you can keep throwing yourself at it and eventually you will win. For better or worse, I appreciated this. It means I never felt the difficulty was inhibiting my enjoyment of the game. I would beat the boss, remember the problem I was having, and then change my approach for the next boss. As you continue to complete quests and kill lots of cool, disturbing enemies, you will explore more of the world the game has created for you, and eventually will move on to the next act. The game is broken up into acts in order to divide the narrative and level difficulty into sections that can be contained within a set part of the world. It contributes to the game's linear feel, but honestly you don't notice it much. You can travel anywhere at any time, so if you miss something, you can always go back. But the main story will keep you leveled to match the content, so you don't ever feel like you need to go back. The end of Act 1 places you directly into a lush forest, which is a great visual to compare the dead shores and caves you just left. But the game always has this disturbing feeling to it. Even in a green, colorful forest, the environment, music, and enemies are constantly reminding you that there is a sense of urgency to keep moving, almost as if it is telling you that you should feel a little uncomfortable and alert when outside of a sanctuary. Think of a Little Nightmares or Slenderman kind of feeling. Some people will really like the feeling of being under pressure at all times, and others will not. I found that it was awesome in small doses, but when you wanted to explore the area and you're being chased by 40 different enemies in a darkened part of the forest, you start to get a little bit anxious. And this is a lot of what the gameplay is going for, which ended up affecting how long I could sit and play the game. But each time I would step away from the computer for a bit, and then I would come back excited to see what I was supposed to do next. Path of Exile is definitely a well-made game. I thoroughly enjoyed my time playing it. But if we are talking about reviewing the new player experience, then I think we have to be aware of some of its shortcomings. Path of Exile is complicated. The systems that the game has built into it, whether that be the numerous character stats or the in-depth passive skill tree, are completely daunting to someone just starting out the game. And I haven't even mentioned other complicated things, like how there's no in-game currency, but instead there's a system of weapon and armor stat altering notes that vendors and other players have attributed some sort of value to. Things as complicated as that sound extremely cool to be a part of, but the difficulty acts as a barrier to entry and keeps anyone new from trying. The new player experience is also very lonely. Granted, if you came in with friends or tried grouping up with random people and got someone to bite, I'm sure you wouldn't feel the same way, but I don't have any Path of Exile friends, and there was no one talking in the early game sanctuaries. In fact, other than a couple of people that would be talking in the world chat, there was not a lot of communication at all. I'm sure that this experience can be different for other people, but to me, it felt like a single player game with an option to watch the chat box for awkward random conversations. This style of game works, and I don't mean for it to sound completely negative. I said it earlier in the video as well. I enjoy RPGs, and I enjoy playing those RPGs with friends. But I wouldn't go into this MMORPG expecting the MMO to be the focal point. I think all in all, the shortcomings of Path of Exile's new player experience can be brought down to two things. Two questions that you will have to ask yourself if you are thinking of trying it out. Do you want to spend the time to understand the complexity of the game? And do you want to play an impressive multiplayer ARPG instead of an MMORPG? If your answer is yes to either of those questions, I highly suggest trying it out. Once you set your expectations of what the game is going to be, it is one of the best experiences you can have in free-to-play games. And I will repeat that. In reviewing this game, I spent no money, no subscription, no purchase. I can play as much and whenever I want, and I haven't even opened the in-game cash shop. Path of Exile is one of the best free-to-play games I have ever played. But we will see if I regret that statement after playing levels 25 to 100. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the video or found it entertaining, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. I appreciate your support, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next. Oh man, watching this video knowing what I know now is absolutely maddening. But I have to remind myself that at this point, I wasn't just new to Path of Exile, I was actually fairly new to the ARPG genre. Path of Exile was my first loot-based hack-and-slash ARPG. I'd played Diablo 3 a bit, but it didn't last very long, so when I came into PoE and it started throwing all this loot at me, skill gems, click to move, the paralyzing visual of a 400-node skill tree, I was confused as all hell. So to try and make sense of all this, I had to use whatever reference I had, and at the time, I was coming from World of Warcraft and a bunch of MMORPGs. So I looked at everything through an MMORPG lens. Oh, Path of Exile has classes? Well, in MMORPGs, classes usually determine base stats, core competencies, available skills, weapon types, proficiencies, and specializations. In PoE, classes don't really mean anything. They just determine where you start on the skill tree. So while it does determine the viability of certain builds, there are no restrictions on any skills, weapons, or specializations. The only thing close to that is Ascendancy, which I didn't even get to in my first impressions video. Obviously, I know now that looking at an ARPG through an MMORPG lens is going to cause more problems than it solves. And I know it bugged a lot of people that I called PoE an MMO, but in my defense, at the time, Path of Exile was listed as an MMO on sites like MMO Population, so my expectation was that PoE was an MMO and an RPG, not a mostly single-player ARPG with trade functionality like it actually is. The other thing I'll mention about this video is how difficult it was to start learning things. I didn't read guides or look up things on the wiki, so anything I learned was done through the help panel or trial and error. Small things like changing left click to move, or that mobility in ARPG combat is absolutely vital to survival. I wouldn't really have learned it on my own, at least not without hours of playtime. Larger things like the stat systems and the skill tree, I still don't fully understand to this day, and some comments I received on my later videos say no matter how long you play, you never fully understand it. So overall, this first impressions video I made almost 2 years ago has so much in it that I no longer agree with or is just outdated now that I know how to play the game, but I still agree with my statement that PoE is hostile to new players. Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alltrades Jack and I'm a Path of Exile casual player. I carry the burden of that title because in no way have I learned enough about this game or spent enough time with it to call myself a master. It's been almost 3 months since my Path of Exile first impressions video, and if I learned one thing, it's that veteran Path of Exile players are extremely friendly and extremely passionate about the game. But I lied. I learned quite a few things from posting a first impressions video, mostly from all your amazing comments on the video. Some of them were a couple sentences, some were essays, but all of them made playing the game way easier. Or at least made it so I didn't die as much. Now when I say I'm a casual player, I say that mostly because I tend to split my time between a ton of different games, which is why it took this long for my second Path of Exile video. I really wanted to put out a video after I'd finished the main story and got to endgame content, but my time over the past few months has been split between like 3 MMOs and Hearthstone, because the new Battleground mode is so fun to screw around with and has me addicted. But eventually I came back and I finished Path of Exile's main story. Here it is, my character in all his glory. A Slayer duelist with high evasion and physical spells, with added fire damage, and I promise I know nothing more about my character than just that. For this video, I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of the most common gameplay advice I received in my first impressions video, and if it affected my gameplay much or not. It may help other new players if they need some tips, but more importantly, with the new Siege of Atlas League coming up, I'm gonna have to do this whole campaign over again with the new character. So please, leave your comments below and let me know if my lessons from the last YouTube comment section are well-founded, or if I need more help because I'm just that terrible at this game, which is completely possible. As always, disclaimers up front. I completed the story, but that doesn't mean I took part in everything. I'll touch on the different side missions and other parts of the games that I unlocked during my playthrough, like the Beast Menagerie or the Rogue Heist Missions Island, but I unlocked them, tried them once, and then moved on. It was getting too close to the end of the current league for me to spend too much time grinding everything in the game, but I enjoyed trying them out. One of the best ways to learn anything in life is to get advice from someone who has experience in that field. And the best way for me to learn Path of Exile is to read guides and YouTube comments from one of the world's most dedicated player base that I've ever seen. Seriously, some of you told me you had over 3,000 hours logged into the game. Which I understand. I played World of Warcraft for 14 years, so I'm not judging you. Far from it, I think it's awesome that a game can provide so much entertainment. So here I am, having only played like 30 hours or something just to get through the story the first time, on one character, having no idea if I could have saved myself 100 deaths by understanding the duelist class and how to build its skill tree better. But let's start with some of the awesome basic tips that you all gave me that completely changed my gameplay. The most common gameplay tip I got was to change my left click to click to move only. Holy hell did this make a huge difference. Before I made this change, I couldn't tell you how many times I got stuck in the middle of mobs or started running around misclicking because the left click was shared between click to move and a spell. After I changed it, I felt like I was walking on air. The entire game was about 50% less frustrating because I knew if I died, it was because I was bad, not because I had a poor mouse setup. I really can't exaggerate enough how important this tip is for new players. If you watch my first impressions video, you know that my strategy with my Marauder was to stand in one place and spam the sweep spell. That was only working because I was in Act 2, which is like level 18 or something like that. My Marauder was just tanky enough to withstand the punishment of standing still, but that wouldn't have lasted much longer. I can tell you exactly what I knew for sure, that constant movement is completely necessary in Path of Exile. It was slowly becoming apparent before, but when I fought General Gravicius in Act 3, only one act later, I found out the hard way that standing underneath the fire bombs was a bad idea. You constantly had to move to avoid them, while still throwing punches to damage the boss. And as I got further and further into the game, avoiding attacks was essential, not just for bosses but for the regular enemies as well. There was this part of the game where I had to fight the Brine King, and I had to complete some quests to open up a passage to actually reach him. The most frustrating part of this was that there were probably 100 enemies on your screen at all times, and there were these water elemental enemies that would shoot out orbs of water that would freeze you for like 5 whole seconds. If I messed up and got hit by one of those orbs, I would go from not being damaged at all to being dead almost instantly. It was extremely frustrating, but it was a good reminder that I needed to practice my movement because the game only got more punishing after that. Just understanding this concept, as remedial as it may be, changed my entire strategy while playing the game. So please, do us all a favor and tell your favorite new players that left click is for move only. One of the complaints I had in my first impressions video was that the mini map in the top left was near useless, and running around with the large map was cumbersome and filled your entire screen. I still feel the mini map is pretty useless, but one of the most common tips I was given was to go to my settings and change the opacity of the large map. The main problem I was facing was that the large map was see-through enough that I wouldn't close it to engage with the constant barrage of monsters you fight in this game, but it wasn't see-through enough to clearly let me see what was going on behind it without straining and bleeding from my eyeballs. And I found myself constantly needing the large map up to find my way around. The game has a ton of locations that are difficult to find your way through with just your memory and a sense of direction, so the large map became necessary for me just to find the next place I needed to go. I feel like the developers probably understood this issue or got feedback from players because they gave you a lot of customization for such a simple map. You can change the opacity of the entire map, but if you want, you can decide which parts to leave visible and which parts to hide. Like, I want the walls to be very visible, but I don't care about seeing the terrain on the map. This was definitely helpful and a much appreciated difference to my gameplay. I could finally see what was going on behind the map, but still have it available to keep moving towards my goal. Yes, I made the unfortunate new player mistake of thinking I should play standard since I had no experience with the game. This, as I was told many times, is incorrect. Everyone plays the League because it's the newest and shiniest content, and your characters end up in standard purgatory at the end of League anyway. Originally, I just thought that standard was like an easy version, and I chose it because I wanted to understand the game before I dove full into it and joined the hardcore players in the current league. I created my Marauder and a bunch of other characters to try out the game, and my entire first impressions video was based on the standard league. Now that I'm older, wiser, and was told by the collective YouTube comments section that I should always play the league, I created a new character, a duelist, to complete the main story in the Scourge League. Funny enough, this league is ending soon, and the Siege of Atlas League will be starting in about a week from writing the script, but as you can see, all of the footage in this video is from my duelist, and I was able to complete the main story before the current league ended. Thankfully, I now have the ability, no, the privilege, of doing this all over again for the new league next week. Not complaining, just preparing myself. But the Scourge League was fun to play through. I'm glad I was told to try it out. It's the newest content, and even though I don't know the intricacies of how exactly the Scourge League differs, I do know that it felt very different to play through. I got really caught up in playing around with the demon fighting toggling system that allows you to upgrade and corrupt equipment by slaying hordes of enemies. Though I think if I had spent more time with the game, I probably could have understood it more and really got more out of the Scourge League. I'm hoping that I can do that with the next league, but I'll give my thoughts on the Siege of Atlas once I learn more of the game and actually try it out for a couple weeks. But I did get this cool Siege of Atlas headpiece cosmetic though. Wore it through pretty much my entire playthrough with my duelist. Don't worry, you don't have to be jealous, but I appreciate that you are. So this is a topic that had a couple of differing opinions that were left in the comments of my first video. The skill tree was something I mentioned was entirely a turnoff to casual players, and I stand by that for the most part, simply because the skill tree looks daunting and takes a long time to understand. Even though I like it and others will too, not everyone is going to enjoy or want to spend the time to figure it out. It may be normal to MMO players to have mechanics that take months to understand, but if someone doesn't want to make that commitment to the game, looking at the skill tree will be their quitting moment. On the flip side, I also mentioned that the skill tree is one of the game's coolest features because it allows for an incredible amount of character customization. I also stand by this, and I found that a lot of my fun with leveling through the main story was trying my hardest to figure out the best way to spend my skill points without looking up a build. I had a lot of fun stacking my duelist with evasion and fire damage and dual wielding mastery, even though I had little to no idea if that was making my playthrough easier or more difficult. It was really exciting to get the flame golem spell and have so much fire damage that all my enemies would burn to death after a single hit. That was until I got to a section where all the enemies had fire resistance. So the advice I got, or rather some of the opinions I was given on the skill tree, are more about the viability of your skills and how committed you'll need to be to build an endgame viable character. There was a consensus that even though there are obviously builds that will be better than others, there is a good variety of meta builds and they change fairly often, so the skill tree never becomes too stale or solved to the point where it becomes pointless to try something new. But it seems that players are having differing opinions on how to attack the skill tree as a new player. On one side, new players are suggested to look up a build based on a spell they like and start the game with a guide, a much more analytical approach that prepares the new player for the endgame with a character that can withstand a beating or deliver top damage. Others believe that a new player should just have fun with it and build whatever they like, since the skill tree really only matters if you're completing difficult endgame content, which may not be something you'll reach if you're just starting out. The fun of the game comes from customization, and for these players, the skill tree is the embodiment of character customization in video games. There is more to the debate on if the skill tree is an accomplishment or a detriment to the game, though from your comments, watching other videos, and reading some guides, one thing is definitely certain. The skill tree may be complex and crazy, but it is one of the defining factors that makes Path of Exile stand out as a unique ARPG. Playing through the entire campaign was a journey. I had so many moments of complete frustration. I had moments where I thought I would just quit and go back to playing Hearthstone, but every time I hit a rough part of the game that annoyed me to no end, the game would throw something cool in my face and bring me right back. Now that I've completed the main story, I wanted to give some honest feedback on my experience. Just a bit. I don't want this video to be too long and bore all of you, so I'll just talk about my favorite and least favorite part of my experience. And keep in mind everything I've said so far about my lack of true understanding of the game. This is just my opinion, and I very well may just be unaware of how to fix that certain negative, or how that positive turns into something terrible for endgame players. So first I want to talk about a couple of observations I made about the game's combat difficulty. As I got further and further into the game, the difficulty rose drastically, as expected. I know, that's how games work. I just felt that Path of Exile's difficulty was a bit over the top and artificial, and that it would unexpectedly spike and drop during some parts of the game. Not all the time. For the most part, I felt that the game was pretty balanced and leaned towards a rewarding but hellish amount of difficulty. If I was dying over and over again, it was because I had to change my strategy and try one more time. But this isn't a game where you have a long fight, make a mistake, and have time to adapt while continuing to fight. In Path of Exile, you try, you fail, and then you try again with a different strategy. Sometimes I would run into combat, both with bosses and with minions, that even though I felt like I was doing the best I could with the loadout I had, the enemy would simply overpower me, or take advantage of a single small mistake I made, and there simply was no time to react. Boom, I was dead. I think the first example of this is the Brine King section I had mentioned before. This is still fairly early on in the game, but by this point, I figured out how to use my guy well enough to do decent damage while on the move. There were a couple points in this one quest where that just wasn't enough, and it started happening more and more from there on. Usually, I would understand if it was because I just needed to play better, but as the game went on, I found myself getting hit with more and more what the f moments. The minions would either be no challenge at all, or the hardest minions I've ever had to face. They would either do no damage to me, or kill me with one hit. Some would freeze me and stun me, so I was forced to sit there and watch my health drop to 0. I realized in retrospect that I had definitely screwed myself with some of my gear and skills, because some online guides told me that I needed way more elemental resistance to even have a chance of staying alive for more than 2 seconds. But how was I supposed to know that going in? And some bosses were even worse. Towards the end of the game, I would just be running around with no clue as to how I was supposed to stay alive for more than 5 seconds. Not to mention that I was supposed to be dealing damage too. I remember there was this sewer boss that had blood balls blowing up everywhere, and I could not understand how I was supposed to dodge all of them, while at the same time dodging the boss who would teleport around and blow up too. On top of that, I had to try and find a time to stop for a moment to do damage. It ended up being a clusterfuck of gameplay. This was also made worse by the fact that every time you respawned in the boss room, the boss fight mechanics were still going. So as soon as you enter the boss room, you would spawn directly in one of those damaging abilities and die again. This was one thing that I appreciated before, because there was little to no break in gameplay when you died. You just spawned outside the room and ran back in. But this ended up being a necessary gameplay element instead of a convenient one, and the positive of getting right back into the action was quickly overshadowed by the negative of spawning in just to die again, and this feature was not available while fighting minions. So anytime you died while fighting minions, you would respawn at your last checkpoint, which in some maps took like 5 minutes of walking to get back to where you were. I also felt that the difficulty spikes at a second's notice and then drops again. It's not that I don't think this can work, but for long periods of playing, it was hard to know what to expect. It feeds into that feeling of anxiety and feeling rushed to keep moving and keep killing, which technically is the point of the game, but it is definitely something you should be aware of when going through the main story for the first time. It's a different type of experience. When you look at this graph of how Path of Exile's difficulty works over the course of the game, you can see how it differs from others. This down here is any new Pokemon game, where it starts easy and only gets slightly more difficult. This up here is a game like Sekiro or Dark Souls, where the game starts difficult and gets harder. And this is a game like Path of Exile. This difficulty curve tells a player that they won't know what's coming next. Moment-to-moment gameplay may be at the top of the difficulty spike or the bottom. So when they die out of nowhere, the player may feel like they didn't have enough time to prepare for it. But keep in mind, I don't like to complain about difficulty a lot. I like having a challenge. And this difficulty could very well be that I just don't understand the game well enough. In fact, I'm sure it is. Obviously, other players have done way more difficult content than this, but in my opinion, part of having a good challenge means that there is a significant feeling of success after you finish, which for most bosses was the case. It was only a few that frustrated me enough that when I finished, I just sighed and said, finally. But I have to stress that just because I have these few frustrations about combat doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. With each consecutive boss fight, I was blown away. The visuals of these fights and the creativity behind each boss was insanely cool. The first one that got me super hyped was the fight against Piety and then Malachi. Not only were we in the belly of the beast that had floors and walls made of viscera and blood, but both of these boss fights were mechanically fun, visually amazing, and made you feel like a badass for completing them. Then every boss fight after that was just as visually astounding. The Katava fight on top of the cathedral got my heart racing. The battle with Lunaris and Solaris was really cool mechanically and conceptually, even though it kicked my ass. I also like the fact that the Scorpion Queen of the Desert fight had phases of very different mechanics. So overall, even though I had some frustrating moments in the combat, and I think it requires a bit more of out-of-the-game knowledge before fully enjoying it, the visuals and sense of sheer epicness of the encounters was unbelievably spectacular. The only other observation I'd like to make in this video is that even though I didn't fully understand everything that was going on with the stats, weapons, craftings, and skill tree, I fully appreciated that it all existed. I think there's something to be said about a game that offers so much character stat customization and still feels relatively balanced to play. I don't know the nuances of how unbalanced or balanced the game actually is. It would take someone with much more of an understanding of the game to truly tell you that, but at least while going through the main story, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I still managed to beat the game. I didn't follow any guides, I only took minor gameplay tips from the YouTube comment section of my first impressions video, and I was able to figure it out. Was my playthrough 10 times harder than it could have been? Maybe. I don't know yet. I'll tell you after I play in Siege of Atlas with a new character, but for this playthrough, I managed to beat the game with my choice of character customization.
I even appreciated some of the optional features of the game, like the Beast Menagerie or the Rogue's Harbor. It gives added depth to the game, and it provides another option on how you can build your character power. I really liked the boss slaying feature that gave you some extra stats for killing optional bosses. I liked the endless delve operation with Nico, the miner. And even though I didn't engage in any of these systems extensively, I appreciated that they gave me the option. Like I said in the intro, if I had more time, I would love to figure out some of these side systems, but I'll leave them for another video. Just to be sure, spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about the last boss here. Quick editor's note, my recording software did not capture my screen correctly during the Kitava fight, so instead of forcing you to watch broken, corrupted footage, I'll be playing a guide in the background of how I was supposed to complete the fight. I didn't watch any guides during my playthrough, so just remember that when I say I didn't know what the strategy was to beat Kitava, I mean that during my actual playthrough, I hadn't watched this video. I apologize for the inconvenience. Okay, some quick thoughts on the final boss and finishing Act 10. The final Kitava battle was insane, and I want to put a question out to anyone watching this. How the hell do you beat this boss? I was able to complete it after dying 100 times and spending about 30 minutes bashing my skull against the keyboard, but I want to honestly know if there's a strategy to this. I know that my character wasn't built for this. Every mechanic in this fight was a one-shot to me, and I didn't really have problems with Kitava's mechanics. I would just be completely overwhelmed in the minion section. My character didn't have enough health to stay alive for more than a couple seconds without me spamming my health potions and trying to get off some attacks for the leech. My character also didn't do enough damage to actually kill any of the minions fast enough to find a break in the onslaught to actually do damage to Kitava. Like I said, I was able to complete it eventually, but I really am curious if there's a better strategy that I could have followed with the setup I had, or if it simply was that I should have built the duelist with better spells. Or maybe I just needed to level up a bit more since I beat Kitava at level 64. The battle was visually perfect. The epicness of the situation and the concept behind the fight was a mastery of building suspense and then following through with a truly legendary battle. And Kitava's mechanics were difficult but fun to try and overcome. The minion phase was really where the fight fell short, at least in my experience. Dying 100 times and then getting a success screen doesn't really make me feel successful. It makes me feel like Doctor Strange, where he beat the big bad guy by just dying over and over again until I got annoyed and left. This isn't a criticism of the boss fight really, it's more of a criticism of the new player experience and how the battles will feel lesser because new players won't understand the game enough to beat these challenges the way it was intended, unless the challenge is to die over and over and slowly whittle down the boss's health. But that's it, that was the campaign. I made it to Ariath and started to do the epilogue, but decided to wait until I could do this with a new character in the Siege of Atlas League. I plan to try playing a Templar in the new league just because I want to try out the class. I will probably start a couple weeks in and finish the campaign over time. I would love to hear your thoughts on the league once it comes out and any tips you may have for me now that I'm spending way more time with Path of Exile. I had a lot of fun playing the game all the way through, at least to maps and the rest of the endgame. Also, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching and commenting on my videos. I really do read every comment and enjoy hearing your thoughts. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video, because that's what I really care about. I hope you enjoy your Siege of Atlas adventures, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.
I think episode 2 really shows how difficult the game can be when you have limited knowledge and don't want to step outside the game to look things up or read a guide. This was the first time I beat the campaign, and I have to tell you, this would have been my quitting moment. I remember telling my girlfriend that I was going to stay up all night to try and get to the campaign because I was so frustrated with how much I was dying that I didn't want to turn it off until I actually beat the content. I wasn't having fun with the game anymore. It was more of a challenge to myself that I wouldn't let the game beat me. And this was for the campaign. The campaign is the easy part now. There are some runs where I'll only have 10 deaths, and it's more so because I'm trying different builds and my survivability needs to be upgraded. That's something I know how to do now. I know how to understand my basic defenses and how to manipulate my stats or my skill nodes to help me live longer. I know that a defensive skill and a movement skill are absolutely necessary to survive. Anyway, the main point I wanted to make was that it was really all the support from the community that kept me playing the game. The 2 video series turned into an 8 video series because of all the essays I was given from players in the comments section. These essays would try and teach me how to understand defenses, how to build your power for different skills, and how to read skill gems and plan your path through the skill tree accordingly. Most importantly, get more health. The advice I was given ended up becoming the building blocks for the rest of my journey, and I promise you it's like night and day. Having a basic understanding of how to build a character gives you a completely different experience than new players who don't have that understanding. But looking back, that was my biggest problem I was facing. My lack of understanding of how to build a character really prevented me from enjoying the game or the gameplay. I was being one-shot all the time and dying too much too quickly. I couldn't understand what I was doing wrong because things were happening behind the scenes that I didn't even know to look for. I think I was pretty fair in my critiques at the time, but really this entire video can be summed up in one phrase. Knowledge is power.
What's up everybody, I'm Alltrades Jack, ex-casual and newcomer to Path of Exile, but you can call me ATJ. I was once just like you, a wide-eyed newbie who threw himself into the fire, and grinding gear games let me burn. So much has changed since then. I've played through the campaign twice. I'm practically a veteran, so let me help you by giving you some unwarranted advice and sharing my experience of playing Path of Exile's campaign the second time. This will be pretty quick, so let's get right into it. So here's the thing, my last video didn't come out too long ago, and in it, I was trying to explain how the game leaves new players without crucial knowledge as to how to play the game, which is the same opinion I had in my first impressions video. You're not going to believe this time I have the same opinion. I wanted to make this video specifically because I wanted to highlight the night and day difference between my attempts at completing the campaign. This is mainly to highlight the importance of having a bit of insider knowledge on the mechanics and how stats work. And yes, with my second playthrough, I found the game to be easy. But let's start at the beginning. I created a new character in the Arch Nemesis League, and I specifically wanted to try out the Templar. The Templar was a class that I really liked all the way back when I was trying out all the classes for the First Impressions video. I had this idea that I wanted to make an elemental warrior that was basically a paladin and a shaman mixed together. This is a World of Warcraft reference, but you get the idea. A holy elemental knight. So I was super excited to start this character, and right off the bat, I got this spell called Purifying Flame. And let me say this now before we get any further. I still haven't looked up any guides. I know a lot of you told me to do that, but I really wanted to see what this game would be like if I just tried my best to build a viable character. I like the exploration and the freedom that the skill tree brings, and if I look up a build, it sort of takes that freedom away. So instead, I just took advice from the YouTube comment section like I did for my last video, and I tried the campaign again. I took Purifying Flame, and from the start, I remembered 2 bits of advice that gave me some guidelines as to how to build a character. First, since Purifying Flame was a fire spell, I jacked up my fire and elemental damage modifiers. I eventually got some great support gems too, so my Purifying Flame was hitting like a truck and had additional lightning damage just to put a little tickle into it. Second piece of advice was to go for elemental resistance and health nodes. Look at this health pool, guys. By the time I beat Katava in Act 10, I had over 2,000 health and 800 shield. For my duelist, I had just under 1,500 health and no shield at all. On top of that, my duelist had the minimum amount of elemental resistance and armor, where my Templar has more armor and resistance than he would ever need, like Sunblock with SPF 350. And these 2 pieces of advice basically turned the game upside down for me. No longer was I bashing my head against the keyboard, yelling at my screen and sometimes my dog. Now I was basically speedrunning the entire game. Nothing could kill me. I didn't die at all until I got to the Lunaris and Solaris fight. I died twice there and then a couple of times after that, mostly because I went AFK. I don't have footage of many of my deaths, so I can't really prove that, but what I can prove is that in my entire run with my Templar, from Act 1 to 10, I only died 14 times. You want to see my death count on my last character? The duelist with no health and no elemental resistance? My first playthrough with almost no knowledge of the game? I cried a bit when I saw that number. Playing with my duelist was a nightmare compared to how breezy and enjoyable the game was with my Templar. And I'm not saying it lacked all difficulty. It wasn't hard, but it wasn't entirely easy. I had to remember the boss mechanics and make sure I was building my character correctly. Towards the end of the game, there were points where I was in trouble of dying, and I actually didn't get past the Merciless Labyrinth the first time I did it. But it definitely didn't feel unfair. I actually had a lot more fun without the insane difficulty. I wasn't completely demotivated, and I felt that I was actually progressing my character. I felt powerful when going up against enemies, and the game did a good job of making me feel in control. Path of Exile is actually really fun. But then I finished the campaign, and I went into the epilogue, and I was introduced to a new feature called the Atlas, with an Atlas map and an Atlas skill tree, and I decided I was going to take a short break. I just learned the basics of Path of Exile leveling, and now there's another skill tree. No explanation given. The only directions given were the basic introductions of, here's a map, put it in that device, and go kill things. Then the commander was like, oh, we need you to do a bunch of maps and kill a bunch of monsters, cause information and other reasons. Don't get me wrong, I like killing stuff. That's like what you do in this game. It's not the gameplay that I don't understand. It's all this extra stuff. And because I don't understand, I'm not going to give a whole lot of opinion on it. I'm going to keep playing and I'll learn more about it so I can give an informed opinion on it later. I just wanted to give my update on how different the campaign was now that I had help in understanding how to build a viable character. It was easy, and now I understand why everyone says the game really starts at maps. I feel like most veteran players would get through the campaign super quick, so I could see how it would feel repetitive to the point of being unnecessary, almost. But I'm not a veteran. This is just my second time playing through the campaign, so I still have a lot to understand about this game and its players. So now that I understand a bit more of the game, I wanted to ask a question to whoever's watching. This comes from a comment that I got on my second look video, where the viewer asked if, as a new player, I had an opinion on the monetization of stash tabs and how it may be considered predatory due to how heavily the game puts an importance on collecting a large number of items. I wanted to put this question out to you, the viewer, and after I give my new player opinion, I hope that you give me yours as well. But before I give my opinion on the stash tabs and stacking items, let me say this first. Path of Exile is a free-to-play game, and free-to-play games will always drive players to the cash shop. There is never going to be an entirely free-to-play game because people make games to make money. And most free-to-play games, the good ones anyway, will say, hey, you can access 90% of the game completely free. But if you want to give yourself this quality of life upgrade, please invest a little money into our game. This isn't a bad thing. Just because a company puts a cash shop into the game doesn't necessarily mean that it's predatory and anti-player. The point at which cash shops become a bad thing is when they heavily affect the gameplay and its core mechanics. Take World of Warcraft, for example, where you can literally buy anything in the cash shop. This includes the infamous WoW token, which gives you a ton of in-game gold to buy the most powerful items and raid or PvP carries. The reason this is such a big deal is because the whole point of playing WoW is to get powerful items and play the raids in PvP. So if you just buy your way through it, you are degrading the entire experience for everyone that plays. The economy goes down, the skill gap between top-tier players and casual players widens, and players lose interest in those parts of the game. So now let's take this back into context of Path of Exile and the stash tabs. I personally didn't find the stash tabs to be too much of a problem. I didn't feel like new players get enough loot to fill up 4 tabs of space. I had a lot left over at the end of the campaign, but I could see how this could get worse as I continue to play, and how it may be seen as the developers creating a problem and selling the solution. Path of Exile is a looter's dream. As you play, you'll find equipment, crafting orbs, divination cards, quest items, skill gems, stat gems and jewels, rogue markers and contracts, maps for the Atlas, and a bunch of other things that I don't really know what they do yet. And in addition to having a constant flow of items going in and out of your inventory, most of these things either don't stack or have a low stacking limit. Having so much loot is a blessing and a curse. It's good because it gives a bunch of different ways that a player could be rewarded depending on what their goal is in the game. The problem, and where some people may think this is predatory, is that you quickly start to run out of space if you don't tightly manage your stash tabs. The crafting orbs are probably most apparent to have this issue. Scrolls of Wisdom, which you must use in order to identify any equipment you want to alter or use, have a stacking limit of 40. As you go through the campaign, you are sort of trained to pick them all up and have them ready at all times, in case you find a new piece of armor that may be an upgrade. But because inventory space is limited, you are also trained to put them away in your stash for later use. But because you can only stack 40 together, by the end of the game, now you have a fourth of your entire stash tab dedicated to just Scrolls of Wisdom. And this is just one item in the list of currencies or crafting orbs. There are a ton of different items that follow the same stacking logic. For example, orbs of transmutation can stack 20 together, and they are extremely common as well. As a new player, this is where stash management can become a bit overwhelming. I don't know what I'll need later on. I don't feel like I understand the game well enough to say definitively that I am at the end game and I'll no longer need orbs of transmutation or scrolls of wisdom. So I'll just let them sit in my stash, along with every single other item that I think I'll need at some point. So 2 problems have been identified here. A lack of information that the developers can give you to understand how to properly manage your stash and use items, and a stacking system that increases the amount of space you use for a single type of item. And Grinding Gear Games sells you the solution. You have a number of different options if you want to expand your stash, but you gotta spend money. Pay more money, get more space. Again, my opinion is that new players don't really feel the effect of this at all, and with 4 tabs of space, you get a lot of game time for free before it really becomes a problem. So do I think this is predatory for new players? No. I think it's a quality of life purchase that could bypass a large problem as you continue to play the game, and technically, you don't have to deal with it until you get further into the game. But that's just new players. Once I get more into maps and try getting into more difficult content, I'll give an update on this question. But for now, I leave it to all of you. How do you feel about the stash tabs and their monetization? Let me know in the comments. Now that I've beaten the campaign, I have a lot of work to do to keep beating maps and going through this atlas. This is where the game starts, right? Can't stop now. So stay tuned for my next video on how I suck at everything again and can't figure out the endgame. Hopefully not. I am really excited to jump into it though. But just to give you all a heads up, I also started to play Lost Ark and have a casual review coming up for it in a couple weeks. I may start to post some content on that game too, depending on if I like it enough. So subscribe to the channel and all that YouTuber stuff if you are interested in seeing some Lost Ark gameplay and conversation. The Committee of Casuals continues with a new game. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to build health and elemental resistance, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.
Okay, for real, I can't even tell you how excited I was to make episode 3. This video was a direct result of the feedback I got from episode 2. All you really have to do is look at the death counter comparison for the 2 characters, and you can feel my relief. This was the episode where I started to feel like I was actually enjoying my time with PoE. Now what I didn't know was that I had basically understood just enough of PoE to make it past the tutorial, then I was so burnt out by that point that when I made it to the endgame mapping portion of the game, I got slapped with the atlas and decided to leave the game then and there. I had just finished trying to understand the skill tree enough to make it this far, and now you want to shove another one in my face? Looking back, I would tell myself that it's actually not that daunting or confusing, that the Atlas tree is just giving you the ability to specialize in which endgame content you want to enjoy. You don't really need to understand all of it, just pick a mechanic you like and stick to it. But at this point in my PoE career, I still wasn't looking up guides, I still wasn't following builds, so I just said fuck it and logged out. Maybe shoving another skill tree that has no helpful in-game explanation into the face of new players isn't the best idea. The other part of this video is about the cash shop and GGG's monetization strategy. Not to toot my own horn here, but even with my limited understanding of the game, I was able to properly explain how PoE isn't predatory, but undeniably has some tactics to drive you to the cash shop, as most free-to-play games do. As I've continued my journey with the game, I've only strengthened my stance on this, even in the face of understanding trade and how you have to have premium stash tabs to sell items. Even though there are hundreds of currency items and small stacking sizes, by the time paying any money becomes necessary, you've already put at least 50 to 100 hours into the game. I mean, by episode 3, I had already put at least 150 hours into the game between all my characters. At that point, I think it's okay for GGG to expect 20 bucks or so for their effort. But safe to say episode 3 was the point of no return for me. I knew I was hooked. So as we watch the next 5 episodes, just keep in mind that after this, I considered myself a part of the PoE community. Welcome everyone, my name is Jack and I'm a Path of Exile casual player. Could we talk about Path of Exile's endgame really quick? Specifically, building a character well enough to get further into the Atlas and actually complete some maps. I made my bow build character, got to tier 6 maps, and tried to beat the Maven Arena Challenge, and I think that's a pretty solid base to talk about a new player's experience with the beginning of the endgame. I'm talking about right at the bottom of the oncoming progression mountain. I think we all know by now Path of Exile is one of those games that relies on its community to pass the torch of information to new players. It doesn't really teach you much in-game. And this created a huge barrier for me once I beat the campaign. What is this Atlas thing? Why are there so many branches and pathways, and is this another fucking skill tree? How do I interact with any of these side systems, and do I have to mess with them at all, or are they just here for fun? And the biggest question of them all that never really gets answered, what the fuck just killed me?
The majority of these questions can be easily answered by a simple Google search. Tons of content creators have made videos over the years explaining what you need to do in the endgame and how to build a viable character to get to high-tiered maps and bosses. Zizaran has an entire series of hour-long videos called PoE University. All of this is there to make sure that you, dear new player, are able to succeed in the endgame. But not me, I'm a rebel, and potentially a masochist. I may need to see my therapist again. I didn't look up any guides, I didn't follow a build for my character, I didn't know how item stats work or how to use the crafting system. I believe that games should provide players with the tools they need to succeed, even if it's not so readily available. So I just used the knowledge I gained from YouTube comments and good old trial and error. And somehow I made it. 9 months, 250 in-game hours later, I'm progressing in the endgame, and I think it's about time that I share some thoughts. Not a full review, I haven't finished the endgame yet, but just some thoughts. This season's coming to an end, and I've put over 100 hours into one character, so I think I'm about tapped for now. So, from the eyes of a guideless new player, what do I think of Path of Exile's endgame? 2 words: magnificent torture. I think the first thing I have to mention is this. At this point, when someone finishes the campaign and wants to dedicate themselves to Path of Exile's endgame, they should be looking for some help from online resources. There is no reason that someone should have to learn all of these complex mechanics and stats on their own. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but I guarantee that at least 50% of my game time was spent on trial and error. I built my own character, I took my lightning arrow gem and made it as powerful as possible, and tried to focus enough on defenses and elemental resistances, but there were questions I had that I couldn't answer, and things I couldn't learn without just pushing forward and learning from failure. Things like, hey, maybe stacking evasion rating isn't enough. Maybe you need at least some armor and a shit ton of health to stay alive, even if you only get hit 25% of the time. And that's really the meat of my critique. My biggest problem with the endgame is how hostile it is to learn things. I've put about 250 hours into the game, and there are still plenty of progression walls I run into. But the issue isn't that I need to learn, it's that there's so much to learn, and the game is extremely punishing to players who are trying to do this on their own. That means without an online guide. When I learned how to manage my elemental resistances and max them out, I was happy for a while, until this game reminded me that my armor and evasion percentages were fucked. At this point, I realized that I had almost no armor because in order to try and build my character using Lightning Arrow, I took a bunch of dexterity-based evasion armor. It just so happened that these armor pieces had green sockets and elemental damage stats. In my mind, I needed enough power to kill things that resisted lightning damage, while also taking down large groups of enemies with quick AoE lightning bursts. So I found myself in an evasion-based build with, on average, a 25% chance to be hit. And I was pretty happy with that for a while. I was powerful with a ton of movement speed, I was rarely getting hit, and when I did, I had the resistances and enough health to soak it and recover. I was enjoying my time playing. Then my gameplay hit an immediate difficulty spike. I fought packs of enemies that would one-shot me, and fought bosses that would deplete my health, armor, and resistance flasks, and then one-shot me. I was unable to progress until I figured out what was wrong with my character. And because I died so many times, so fast, without any tool in the game to tell me why, I was left to just guess. Every time this happened, I would stop and think, why did this group of about 40 different monsters kill me? They each have different attacks, so I guess it has something to do with my lack of resistances, but all my resistances are maxed. Okay, maybe it was because I have no health. Well, I've taken all the health nodes around me, crafted health modifiers onto some of my armor, and I'm still below 3000 health. How do I get more health? Okay, well maybe I need more armor because evading 70% of all attacks coming at me is obviously not cutting it. How do I do that with my dex-based character? Maybe I can wear this item that gives me a huge bump in strength so I can start wearing armor and evasion items instead of just evasion. Okay, now I just have to find good enough armor that can maintain the same power in my bow because I'm already running into issues where I can't kill things before I run out of flasks. Shit, now I'm fighting this monster that can't kill me, but I can't kill it. This is the thought process that went through my brain over and over again. Without a guide to help me or a build to follow, I was just taking shots in the dark. Luckily, this was my 4th character, so I knew enough of the base mechanics and stats to keep trying, but at some point I got extremely frustrated with how little I knew of how to fix problems with my character. The game doesn't tell you what killed you or how you died, so you're basically just guessing on what defenses are lacking by looking at your character sheet. The game doesn't give you any indication of certain power thresholds either, for example, how much damage you should be doing or how much health you should have. You're left to figure that out by how quickly you can defeat enemies and how long you can stay alive. Not only is there a lack of tools to help you understand your specific situation, but as you're learning, the game is actively punishing you with things like the leveling experience death penalty. That's right, every time you die, you are set back a chunk of experience, and it takes a long time to get that experience back. This leads to moments when you're in a map with hundreds of enemies running at you, hundreds of ability effects going off, and all of a sudden you've lost 90% of your health, and next thing you know, you have the resurrect options on your screen, and you choose to hit Alt F4.
But just for a moment, forget about dying a lot and the setback to the leveling experience, forget stats and the confusing crafting system. Let's ask a very basic question. What do you do in the endgame? Well, Commander Kirik here says that we should be completing maps. He sells us some and can give us map quests to complete. Maps drop on the floor often enough, but each of these maps is different and has a different location on the atlas. Okay, common sense is telling me that one tier of map will lead to another adjacent map, and when you complete that map, it'll open up the next tier and so on and so on. But all the maps are dropping randomly, so it's all RNG. Your pathway through this atlas is based on RNG. It's not only confusing, it's randomized. I still don't know how to get some of these maps or what their importance is. What's this note here saying I can collect someone's soul? I beat that boss already, but I didn't collect a soul. Well, here's something I did figure out pretty easily with help from the game. Once you get to tier 6 maps, otherwise known as yellow maps, you meet Maven and the Envoy, who tells you that Maven will watch you fight the bosses of maps tier 6 and above and alter them a little bit to challenge you. Then when you beat them, you collect their souls. Collect 3 of these bosses and you'll be invited to Challenge Arena to fight those 3 bosses, 2 at a time. This is probably the easiest part of the endgame to understand. Regardless of what your pathway through the Atlas is, you can just RNG any 3 bosses and try and fight them in Maven's arena. If you want to pick your bosses, just toggle off the Maven thingy and wait for your favorite map to show up. Then there are some other systems, and I gotta tell you, with how much I had to learn to get this far, I didn't even start figuring out these things. Like, what the hell are these splinters for? What is this card game of interrogation or kill? So put all of this complexity together, and you have a new player having to juggle stat mechanics. They have to build their passive skill tree to fit whatever ability they want to use, which also includes mixing and matching the correct skill and support gems, by the way, which is its own discovery process. They have to try and fail and guess on what kills them in order to learn the weaknesses of their defenses, of which gets them punished by the XP death penalty. And on top of that, there really isn't a clear direction on how to progress in the endgame, since the Atlas is a confusing mess and the maps that drop are RNG. Now, I know now how all of this generally works. Kind of. But I dedicated 100 hours to this game, basically spent an entire season just learning how all of this shit works. The complexity of the game pushes you to look for outside help, and that leads you to guides and YouTube videos and following a build. Like I said, once you get to this point in the game, I think it's okay that you're expected to do some outside research. What I don't like is that there's a huge difference in the game between someone like me and someone who follows a guide, downloads add-ons, uses someone else's build, and watches Izaran's hours of university lectures. We aren't playing the same game. The only external help I took was YouTube comments and one loot filter, so my experience was just different. I can't overstate this enough, Path of Exile almost requires you to do online research and use external tools to progress into the endgame, and that makes the game extremely difficult to get into. While veterans may be used to downloading and using third-party add-ons and following seasonal build guides, a new player won't be, so all of this gets added to the barrier to entry for the endgame. And if the endgame of Path of Exile is the real game, and the campaign is just the tutorial, having that much of a barrier to entry and punishing players who try to learn on their own is going to heavily divide the player base. Either you are a hardcore, dedicated fan of Path of Exile who is willing to spend hundreds of hours to experience the actual meat of the game, or you're a casual player who, every so often, likes to come and build a character to beat the campaign and then leave once you hit your natural progression wall. And for both of these types of players, the game is perfect. You either don't care enough to get too involved, or you are so overly invested that looking up guides and using third-party tools is just second nature. However, this alienates everyone in between. What if you just want to try? What if you don't have hundreds of hours to play Path of Exile, but you beat the campaign and you want to try and progress a bit further? What if you care enough to not give up when you hit a progression wall, but don't want to download add-ons, look for builds, or watch hours of YouTube videos to break through that wall? These players caught in the middle don't have many tools in the game to understand what's wrong with their particular character and why they can't progress to more difficult content, and they will be faced with the decision to look it up or stop playing. Alright, I think I've complained enough. Now let me tell you the number one reason why I loved this experience and why I will most likely be trying once again to get into the endgame bosses in the next season. My love for this game can be summed up in one feeling: a sense of accomplishment. Why do people play Dark Souls, Sekiro, or Elden Ring? These games are extremely difficult and their mechanics are complicated, so why do people love these games so much? A sense of accomplishment. The greater the challenge, the greater the feeling of achievement after overcoming that challenge. And what FromSoft games do so well is provide the player with the tools to find a way to overcome the challenge. It's not easy, but it's always possible. Path of Exile does the same thing, just in a different way. Path of Exile requires you to build your knowledge so you can dive deeper into the game. It pushes you to overcome challenges by searching for answers, either by trying something and learning from it, or by seeking the knowledge of those who have already tried it. This is where the game truly shines. Whenever I felt frustrated, whenever I kept throwing myself at an enemy and ran out of portals for a map, I would stop, take a break, and come back to look at the problem a little more analytically. Where can I shift my passive skill tree? How can I alter my armor just a bit to keep my resistances up, but to better serve my abilities? Do I need all of the movement speed, or should I give some of this up to make sure I'm not running out of mana so often? I would try something, fail, learn, and repeat, and eventually I got something right. I didn't even notice this at first, but it was happening all along, and it's the only reason I never gave up and never looked up a guide. After blindly changing things with my character, every so often I would get a power boost in some way. I would gain a level and I'd be able to pick up a new skill node to better my defense. I would learn the basics of crafting and get more health, or generally make sure all my gear had the max amount of prefixes and suffixes. I would find a new item that had that one specific stat I needed and still kept all my resistances up to max. I kept moving forward, having a general goal of completing maps, leveling up, and beating the merciless labyrinth. And then at one point, I sort of picked up my head and realized that the rune color on the map was different. Instead of white, it was yellow. I had progressed to tier 6 maps and I didn't really notice. I realized that I could easily beat the merciless labyrinth that had one-shot me so many times before. I hit level 80 and had over 3,000 health. I had even solved my mana problem. I was progressing, and even though it took an extremely long time, I can't even describe to you how good it felt to beat a tier 6 map boss and have the Maven quest on my screen. And yes, I went on to try and beat Maven's arena challenge. I did not beat it the first time, but man was it such a good feeling to know that I at least made it this far. What a good feeling to know that I didn't fail, that I could make a character to get at least this far. And yeah, I'm probably making a big deal about this and veterans are like, dude, tier 6 is just the tutorial of the endgame. But you know what? I did this on my own, trial and error, and yeah, I'm also probably still not that good at the game. But I feel accomplished now. So if there are any new players watching this video, please be aware of the investment it takes to really progress in this game. The game punishes you while you learn, but pushes you into complex mechanics at the same time. It doesn't leave any of the content easily accessible and pushes you into community resources to learn anything. It takes a lot of time and focus, but the process is incredibly fun and rewarding beyond belief. And for any of you dear viewers, I'd love to hear your experience with Path of Exile, both endgame and campaign. I'd love to hear about how long it took you to learn things, or if you just never had the motivation to progress too far into maps. I'd really like to know if anyone else has tried to learn this game without dipping into the community for guides, builds, and learning mechanics. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Even though I didn't get that far into endgame, this one took a long time to make, and I'm truly thankful for your support. I hope you enjoy your adventures into the Atlas, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.
Ah yeah, my first adventure into mapping. My experience with the beginning of maps was only this way because I decided that I was going to learn on my own. Following a build, reading a guide, using the wiki, without those things I was only progressing by hitting wall after wall and breaking through to keep going. I'm not gonna lie, it was incredibly frustrating, and I think it heavily increased the amount of hours I was playing, which again contributed to season burnout. I think the problem is that when you don't understand what's wrong, you can't solve the problem. So if you haven't read a guide or otherwise learned how to understand why you're dying, you're left to guess. And that means that every single time you die, you're gonna be questioning your build. You're going to be trying out different stat combinations on your equipment, which means using a bunch of currency to try and craft the perfect set. You're going to be slowly figuring out the best combination of skills and support gems. Now that I've learned more, now that I've followed a couple build guides, I know certain tips and tricks on how to identify problems and find solutions, but back then, I was just flying blind. And just like the last video, even though I had hit a milestone in my progression, I truly did not understand how much I didn't know about the game. The iceberg goes deep, and I had barely broken the surface. I will say though, I'm pretty proud of the skills I used in the build I had. Without any outside help, I was able to put together a pretty viable lightning arrow build with additional ballista damage. If I had understood more about defenses, flasks, and how certain stats complement each other, I probably would have been able to go much further in the endgame with the build that I actually like to play. Not bad. I might need to go back and try this one again.
If you're thinking of playing Path of Exile, follow a guide. Sorry, forgot to start with an intro. Quick, roll the intro clip. Hey, new guy! Aw, don't you look all sweet and innocent, untainted by the sweaty, rage-inducing, seasonal grindfest that is Path of Exile. I'm so glad you're thinking of joining our community. Now, before you start playing the game with us, let me ask you a question so I can better guide you into playing the right way. Question 1 of 1. Do you want to play Path of Exile Hardcore Blind Death Metal Rage Mode? Or do you want to play Path of Exile Character Building Simulator? What's the difference? Let me tell you. My name is AllTradesJack, and if you've watched any of my other 4 PoE videos, you know that I was a Path of Exile casual player who enjoyed the game without following a guide or looking up builds or basically understanding the game. I tried to learn all the mechanics and character building using the tools available to me within the game, which isn't that much. I'm a lot older now. The past year has aged me and my mind has expanded to understand the true greatness of the sheer amount of content that Path of Exile has to offer. But the only reason I'm able to stand here today and tell you my story as a Path of Exile player is because of a life-changing event I call following a guide. In this video, I plan on helping any new and casual players like myself understand that it's okay to start playing PoE with a build guide. There is so much more to learn, and following a guide is basically the only way to play the game with the foundational knowledge required to succeed. There are 2 games called Path of Exile. One game you play before you look up a guide, and one you play while following a guide. They are so different, it really could be called Path of Exile 1 and 2, and the new one coming out sometime in the future should be number 3. Honestly, I can't decide which game I like better. Playing Path of Exile without a guide is kind of freeing. It has this open feeling of possibility and a constant state of learn, adapt, and overcome. But the problem comes with the frustration of constantly hitting that progression wall. You will learn, eventually, but eventually is a really long time. And getting to new popular content is entirely dependent on you getting to that eventuality. It took me roughly 300 hours and 5 characters to get to Tier 6 or Yellow maps. 300 hours to get to the first Maven challenge. After that, I burned out. I practically skipped the Lake of Kalandra season and was gonna skip the current season, the Forbidden Sanctum, but I didn't like that I lost any motivation to jump back into the game. Path of Exile is fun. It's tough and complicated, and most people barely get through the tutorial, but it's fun. So I decided that to get myself motivated again, it was time to make a change. This season, I followed a guide. I built a Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder, and it opened up a whole new game. About 90% of what I learned on my own was covered in this build. All of that trial and error, those 300 hours, made unnecessary in a single 6-step build. On my last character, getting through the campaign, through white maps into Tier 6 yellow maps, took about 80 hours of play. I was fumbling around with my build. I was trying to get enough currency to constantly recraft my items to hit my resist caps and get more than 3,000 health. I was trying to gain enough experience to offset how much I was losing by dying all the time. Not only was building my character hard, but I had no clue how to interact with any of the extra content that could help me along the way. What are these splinters for? What the heck is this interrogation kill thingy, and what should I unveil? Why does this guy keep wanting me to kill pests in his garden? Without a guide, you're left to figure out all of this on your own, and I would consider most of this, with the exclusion of the side content, the base knowledge that you need to play the game. So my new experience with a guide meant that the campaign, irrelevant. It's not even part of the game really, it's basically just a tutorial and a way to get extra passive skill points. I practically cruised through the first 5 tiers of white maps with only a little bit of an adjustment to my build. I completed the last labyrinth and got my last ascendancy points. I even got to the first Maven Arena challenge and beat that first try. I got a quest for the Searing Exarch. Who is that? Don't know. I didn't read the little expository paragraph about him, but I'm past level 80 and now I can start playing the game. It's at this point that I ran into new problems, ones that I had never reached before because I had burnt myself out on building a viable character. But before I get to that, I want to reiterate how different the game experience is with and without a guide. The guide itself taught me everything I needed to know on how to build a Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. Step by step, skill point by skill point, it told me which gems to use and which supports I needed at which time. It told me how to use aura skills and manage my mana with reservation masteries. It told me exactly what rewards to get from each quest so that I could get through the campaign the fastest. It told me when to go to the labyrinths to get my ascendancy points. Most importantly, for everything that I did, it told me why. And that's something you can't get from the game. Why do you need a 6-link body armor as fast as possible? That's pretty self-explanatory, but it's because it nearly doubles your damage output from a 4-link. Why did I get damage over time, chance to poison on hit, and attack speed nodes on the passive skill tree? Well, that's because poison scales with chaos damage over time, and can stack, meaning you want to hit fast and apply poison with every hit. Why do you want to buff your life flasks, have 2 of them, and constantly increase your ability to gain flask charges? Well, Poisonous Concoction takes charges off your life flasks in order to deal more damage. That damage scales with the amount of health recovered by the flask, so you want to have a flask that can heal as much as possible and uses the least amount of charges so you don't get caught unable to heal yourself. Yes, you can figure this out in the game using the descriptions that GGG gives you, but when you are learning as you go, it could take years to optimize the 400 node skill tree to hit mana reservation, chaos damage, poison on hit, shield mastery, life, leech, and onslaught nodes all at once, using the most efficient path to get there. It could take years to figure out that you can have 3 different auras, 2 different poison and 3 different hex application methods, an absorption shield, a shield charge for movement, and an enrage buff, all that work together to create this perfect mix of offensive and defensive qualities. I wouldn't even have put 2 and 2 together and thought, hey, you know what would be a good build? If I threw away my weapon and decided to huck bottles of poison at my enemies from behind a massive shield. This is called optimization, and it's something that usually takes a level of understanding beyond that of a normal person. I've said it before in my other videos, but people who make build guides are brilliant. The level of game intelligence it must take to figure out all of this stuff to an extent that you can optimize it and make it efficient to play is insane. And you know what's even crazier? Even after reading this build guide and being directed on how to engage with character building, there is still about 50% of the game that I have no clue about. I still don't know who the Searing Exarch is, or how his influence on certain map tiers affects me. I've beat the Maven Challenge 3 times, but I don't know what these Maven Challenge recipes are on the map device. I just got the Eater of Worlds quests, and I have no clue what he or she does. I have just barely understood the altars that pop up in your maps that you can spend points on to get extra rewards. It's such a weird feeling to have followed a guide and still be a beginner. But I guess that's what really cements it for me. Most people say that new players should follow a guide on their first playthrough, and after seeing how the game is when playing without a build guide, in contrast to how the game is when playing with a build guide, my advice is this. Do you want to have fun exploring the campaign and building characters that fit your fantasy? Or do you want to play Path of Exile? In all seriousness, if you have any intention of getting a character past white maps in the endgame, you should follow a build for your first time. It's not that I don't like learning on my own through trial and error, but trust me when I say that there is so much more to learn even while following a guide. A guide just allows you to get to the point where you can see any of this endgame content. Even with a guide, I haven't been able to get to tier 16 maps yet. I'm sure I can, but I've spent around 90 hours on this character, and I'm raiding in WoW, and I'm playing more games for upcoming reviews, and I'm trying to get back into rugby shape. If the season ends and I haven't made it to tier 16 maps, well, standard will have to do. There are definitely upsides and downsides to following a guide. Path of Exile is just such a huge game that without a guide, there's a very, very low chance that a new player will ever experience the later half of it. So really, I'll say this again and again because it bears repeating, the question comes down to, what is your goal in Path of Exile? Now that I've been on both sides of this debate, I don't think following a guide is as harmful as I expected to the idea of exploration and experiencing the fun of learning on your own. It feels kind of like a graduation. Now that you've gone through the work to learn how to build a semi-viable character, here's a guide you can follow so you don't have to worry about that anymore and move on to more complicated things. Before I had a guide, I was learning and playing the base game. How do the base mechanics and stats work with the character? All my trial and error, all that exploration of what works and what different skills do, what armor works best for what type of build, all of that could be summed up as the first 20% of the game. So then I followed a guide. I spent 10 minutes reading through it and learning what the different terminology was. I learned what it was asking me to do and when, and now I can play the rest of the 80%. And let me tell you, just because I'm following a build now, doesn't mean I'm good at the game, or can make this unbelievably unbeatable character. The Poisonous Concoction build has weaknesses, and it's up to me to be able to alter my armor and gameplay to make up for those weaknesses. I still need to know how to craft and use currency correctly and a bunch more things. I'm still constantly learning new things as I play, things that a build guide doesn't outright tell you. It just gives a foundation on which I can start playing the game, a foundation that is almost a necessity. Once you get to these higher levels, the game is extremely hectic. I'll just come right out and say it. I don't even see my character anymore. I just see a bunch of pretty flashing colors and moving blurs on the screen when things die around me. There is no discernible gameplay other than to move as much as possible and do enough damage that you can kill things before they overwhelm you. Plenty of times I've gotten to the point where there are just so many things on the screen and so many calculations happening at once that my computer almost explodes. And it's kind of fun for the most part. It just sort of amplifies a couple of the problems that I had before. I'm still confused as to why I die, but now it just happens faster and there are more factors affecting my death. I'm still confused as to how some of the buffs and debuffs on monsters work, but now every map has a much longer list of monster changing attributes. But with the foundation that the guide has given me, I feel much more prepared to learn these things on my own. Maybe for a little while anyway, before I go look it up on the wiki. One guide later, and my understanding of the game has far exceeded that of last season. And like I said, if I had more time in my life, I could keep progressing. I know I'm not that far from tier 16 maps, there are more passive skill points that I want to spend on my guy to make him even stronger, and I really want to beat an endgame boss. I did actually beat this one boss that shows up in the Abyssal Depths. That was extremely fun, so it makes me want to see how awesome the other fights are. Watching my gameplay back, I feel like it would be so confusing to anyone starting the game. That's how I was when I first started. I would look at gameplay like this and be like, what the actual fuck is going on? And now, after having played for over 400 hours, my only critique for Path of Exile is that it's hostile to new players, your CPU, and potentially light or color sensitive people. And to you, my dear viewers, my only question to you this time is, any suggestions for my next build? But most importantly, I hope you enjoy the video. Making Path of Exile videos is extremely time consuming, but it's definitely the series that I enjoy the most. I appreciate you all for watching. Remember to leave a like and comment, and sub if you haven't already. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Sanctum League, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.
Listen, I'm extremely proud of the way I learned Path of Exile, and honestly, I think I did myself a favor. It took a long time and was incredibly frustrating, but it gave me such a good understanding of how to play through experience. That being said, maybe I would change a few things if I could go back in time. One of them being that I would have told myself to follow a guide much earlier on. Maybe not for my first character, but probably as soon as I beat the campaign on my own. Not to generalize here, but following a build guide is probably the preferred and recommended way to play Path of Exile. I don't think most people have the time that I did to dump into a single game to frustratingly fail and learn by trial and error. That's a luxury afforded to me by the tail end of a pandemic quarantine, a new work from home day job, and video editing as a hobby. Builds, guides, and other form of community knowledge are the only things keeping Path of Exile attainable for new players, at least the mapping portion of Path of Exile. And whether it's a positive or negative, one of the points I repeat over and over in the video is that even after following a build guide, you still have the majority of the game to learn. Just because you follow a guide doesn't mean you can actually beat the game. Even after following my third build and allowing myself to trade, I'm just able to beat normal tier 16 maps. At the time, I was also starting to deal with some life things that were taking up more of my time. As we came out of the pandemic and I started taking on more responsibilities at work, my time to spend on learning Path of Exile started to get shorter and shorter. This would continue into the next couple videos, but it started with episode 5. So now, with all my responsibilities taking up as much time as they are, I'm glad I started to use the community resources that were available to me. So following a build guide was good advice. All of you who commented on my videos and told me to look stuff up, yeah, you were right, but damn am I still proud of learning the way I did.
Is it just me, or does the Marauder class and Juggernaut Ascendancy seem to be so much easier to start with than any other class and Ascendancy combination in the game? Even without a build, the Ascendancy and skill trees gives you so much access to health and defenses, it makes it so much easier to understand how to build your survivability, and being able to survive longer makes it easier to understand the other mechanics of the game. To take it a step further, it also turns out that the Righteous Fire Juggernaut build specifically has an entire website dedicated to it, created by the guy who made the build, Pox. I hope I'm saying that right. I understand that there are plenty of easy to play, easy to learn builds to try out, and I haven't had nearly enough time to go through them all, but I did take a look at a few of the ones that you all recommended in my last video, and eventually I decided I was going to try out the Righteous Fire Juggernaut. It was the most commented build, and I really wanted to try and make a Marauder work since that was my very first character when I started PoE a year and a half ago. If you want to follow the RF Jug build, you have an entire wiki dedicated to teaching you step by step what to do and when. You have written guides, video guides, a path of building guide that he helps you download. You're told what skills, what supports, what weapons and armor, what passive skill notes to choose, and what stats to look for. You're given a step-by-step play on pretty much everything. The Path of Building tool even has all this broken out by level ranges, so you can follow along as you are leveling. It's pretty insane, and my god do I have a lot of respect for Pox. This is complete dedication and love for a craft, and I hope he gets the recognition he deserves for putting all of this stuff together, because I personally think that he has created the new player tutorial that every aspiring PoE player should try first. That being said, I didn't follow all of this. I pretty much just used the Path of Building guide and the campaign bandit tips. I didn't really read the equipment section, although I did read what stats I was supposed to look for, and I kind of went on my own for flasks, even though eventually I ended up pretty close to what he had. I did follow his guide for everything that I thought was crucial, which was the required skill gems, necessary stats, skill tree, and descendancies. But I've put about 500 or so hours into the game at this point, so I know a bit more than a new player would. Just a bit more. I was still blowing past all the content though. This build made everything before yellow maps a joke. I actually ended up beating the first Searing Exarch Black Star encounter in half the amount of time it took for my last character to even get the quest. To be fair, this was my second character this league. I had a ton of currency left over from my Poisonous Concoction character, as well as some help from a friend on some awesome leveling uniques. But my build and my ability to follow directions isn't exactly what I want to talk about. I wanted to make this video to really push the RF Jug build for new players. Not to say that the Poisonous Concoction build wasn't awesome, but with all this information and support from the guy who created the build, in addition to the fact that the Marauder class and Juggernaut Ascendancy seems to be super new player friendly, this has to be the #1 tutorial build that I think everyone should try first. If you agree with me or just want to take my word for it, that's it. That's the video. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe and all that jazz. But for all of you critical thinkers out there, let me give you 5 main reasons why I think new players should start with a Righteous Fire Juggernaut. Of course, the first reason is that you have the RF Jug wiki there to help you every step of the way. I personally believe that new players should try their very first character without a guide. But once you start diving into the game a bit more and need some help along the way, you have an entire website dedicated to doing that for you. Easy to read guides, YouTube videos, streaming content you can follow along with, a path of building guide that acts as your introduction to the third-party tool that everyone uses. A new player can figure out a lot on their own, but having these resources here in case they need them is like a father running alongside a bicycle to make sure their child doesn't fall the first time they ride without training wheels. I don't have too much else to say here, just another big shout out to Pox for putting all of this stuff together. It seems like a lot of you have already seen it since you all told me about it, but if you haven't, definitely check it out. Alright, the second biggest reason is the fact that the passive skill tree and ascendancies are organized in a way that you can heavily stack defenses to contribute to your survivability. Personally, the reason I almost quit on my second character was because of how much and how quickly I was dying. I had no understanding of the game, so when my duelist with about 1200 health was getting one-shot by literally everything, I was pissed off and confused. At that point, if I hadn't told myself that I was going to make a YouTube video out of it, I would have uninstalled the game right then and there. Luckily, I made my second YouTube video, and all of you beautiful viewers were there to give me advice and generally give me an idea of how the game works. I was still adamant that I wasn't going to follow a guide, but your advice kept me playing. The most important thing that you all told me? Build defenses. Constantly upgrade your gear to find the best combination of armor and evasion while maintaining the most health and max resistance stats. The Marauder starts next to all of these health, armor, and resistance nodes, and the Juggernaut Ascendancy is unrivaled in survivability, adding in layers upon layers of health, armor, and life regen. Because of this, you need much less focus on health, armor, and resistances coming from your equipment. Of course, you still need to have them, but you get so much more help from the skill tree. Let's take out the Righteous Fire part of the build for the moment. How easy is it to tell a new player, hey, you can make any build you want, but if you start as a Marauder, any build you make will have the defenses there for you baked into the class, so you can focus on other things while you learn. And if you really want to focus on learning and buff your defenses so you can beat the campaign without any trouble at all, take the Juggernaut Ascendancy, which makes your survivability your main weapon. Whatever damage you can inflict, you can take so much more, which means as long as you start to understand the mechanics of the enemies and bosses around you, you can basically outlast them. It's so much easier to understand the rest of the game if you aren't constantly dying and getting frustrated or discouraged, so I firmly believe that the Marauder class and the Juggernaut Ascendancy is the best tutorial build for new players. So now let's add in the Righteous Fire part of the build back into the mix. Going with the theme that we want this new player to learn as much as they can about the game, what better way to do that than to keep it simple and provide them with a strong single button build setup. For those of you who don't know, the Righteous Fire skill burns enemies around you for a large amount of fire damage. That's the pretty ring of fire you're seeing in all my footage. The catch is that this skill burns the caster as well, meaning that if it's on, you're taking fire damage until you run out of health. So the point of this build is to buff your life regen as much as possible so that you out-heal the burn damage it would cause you. In addition, you have multiple defense skills, multiple auras to buff your defenses and damage, a golem companion who takes unwanted hits for you and provides more life regen, and 2 different movement skills that provide for easy and quick mobility. You only really have 3 damage spells, one being Righteous Fire, and the other is not really being used at all unless you have some beefy monsters in front of you that need a bit more damage to bring them down. The Fire Trap that you can throw at enemies to cause more fire damage in an area, and the Infernal Cry skill, which will burn a bunch of enemies around you and make them explode, which is just satisfying as all hell to see on your screen. That's the build setup in a nutshell. The fact that you can basically run around and kill most enemies brings down the difficulty by a crazy amount. Sometimes you have hundreds of enemies on the screen at once. And as a build with short range, you have to learn which of the enemies hit harder, which cause ailments that can affect your survivability, which ones explode on death. You have to understand and be aware of bleeding effects and shock. You have to learn which flasks to use and remember to keep them up at all times. And these fights last seconds, so you don't have much time to sit there and calculate your next move. You need to have that awareness and be able to act on it within the same moment. So being able to learn how to interact with all these mechanics is a game changer for a new player. The Righteous Fire build says, why don't you focus on staying alive? And if you can stay alive long enough and throw some abilities out at the right time, you can overcome all of this madness. I can't overstate enough how beneficial that is to a new player. I said it in my last video, but when I started playing, I would look at the gameplay of some YouTubers or streamers and be confused as to what I was even looking at. Once you get to maps and beyond, the screen becomes nothing but a blur of pretty colors. So being able to survive longer than 2 seconds if you make a mistake is crucial to a new player's ability to understand what is happening on their screen. It may not be the most fun build, as it basically turns into a speedwalking simulator, but it definitely allows you to learn. And that's really what I would look for in a new player tutorial for PoE. On top of the build being relatively easy to use in combat, it's also extremely beneficial in helping a new player understand the mechanics of the game. Just due to the nature of building an extremely tanky character with a passive damage over time playstyle, you know for sure that a new player will learn all the defense stats like health, armor, and life regen. They'll learn the differences in damage types, spells versus attacks, damage over time versus immediate damage. Actually, I'm just going to give you a list of the cool things that I learned following this build. Over the course of building an RF Juggernaut, you will have a chance to learn the differences between burning damage and fire damage, the differences between damaging versus non-damaging ailments, maximizing mana reservation and using health reservation, building loads of defenses, elemental resistances, stacking armor and health and using endurance charges, the mixing of spell damage, fire damage over time, burning damage, and area of effect on your skill tree to maximize the damage you're doing and how big your circle is. There's a lot more, but that's just the stuff that I thought was interesting. It's not that the other guides can't teach you these things, but it's definitely a plus that with the Righteous Fire Juggernaut build, you can learn this while also making the game a bit more approachable. Okay, so this last one is an extremely important one. I haven't really touched on trade too much before, but I'll start the discussion in the context of this video. If you have patience and a bit of luck, you can build RF Jug on solo self-found pretty easily. The build only starts to require uniques after level 83, and you can get by without them until around level 90-ish. Basically, there's no need to trade until very late in the game. I personally look for builds that are easily done without trading or without many unique weapons or armor, and this is specifically because I don't really want to engage with the trading system in PoE. I'm not a fan of how many extra steps there are outside of the game to make a successful sale or purchase. Just the fact that you have to go to a third-party website to trade is not my cup of tea. It sort of rubs me the wrong way and I get really stubborn about stuff like that. PoE trade deserves its own video to talk about, but either way, it's a whole lot to ask a new player to go outside of the game to trade items. Not only do they have to go to a third-party website and pay for a new stash tab, but at the same time, PoE is so complicated that the new player may not even fully understand why they want that item, or what price it should be. They are much more susceptible to being scammed, or just paying way too much for an item they may not need. Which I know some people say is like the experience of trading or whatever, but my point is that it's kind of daunting to ask a new player to go out of their way to try that. And if new players don't want to engage with the trading system, then sometimes following a build that asks for a very specific item or a very specific unique will add in a whole new facet to the game. That player may just burn out on trying to get that one unique to drop with the right stats so that they can continue on with their progression. So I think that it's a plus that the RF Jug is a pretty SSF friendly build. There are 3 uniques recommended on the build guide, and they don't become recommended until you get to around level 90 or so, which at that point, a new player can make a choice to either trade, find another way to make up those stats, or wait for the right drop to happen now that you're killing enemies in mass amounts just by walking over them. I'm sure there are more benefits to using this build as a new player tutorial, but I won't take up any more of your time for now. Before I end this video though, I do want to mention one negative about RF Jug. I sort of mentioned it before, but obviously this build is circled around passive gameplay. Just walk forward and try not to die too fast and enemies around you will die first. I liked the build, and I thought it was fun to try out once. I got to experience so much more of the game in about half the time I spent on any other character because I was overpowering most content and I almost could not be killed. But I will say, in my opinion, passive gameplay makes me feel a bit like I have training wheels on. It's fun to watch things drop dead around me, but I almost feel like I've entered the easy mode PoE instead of the normal one. I mean, easy in comparison, not actually easy. I haven't gotten to the true endgame yet where things are actually hard. I'm pretty sure that just means that I've started to understand the game enough where I can continue learning with builds and gameplay that I personally enjoy and don't need to stick with the training wheels that RFJug gives me. But this video is not about me. Just because I've spent 500 hours in PoE to get to this point doesn't mean all new players will. So my statement stands. If you are a new player and want to learn as much as possible about how to play Path of Exile, if you want to access the hidden true tutorial, choose the Marauder class, the Juggernaut Ascendancy, and follow the RFJug build by Pox. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy your Ring of Fire adventures, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next. I just want to say thank you to everyone who told me to try Righteous Fire from Pox. It was probably one of the best guides I've seen, and with how much I didn't know at the time, all the information there was necessary. In the third build guide I tried, I wasn't really given much of anything in comparison, just a path of building link and a few notes here and there. Man, you don't know what you got till it's gone. I'm sure the third build guide was just fine, and players with more experience than me would probably be able to follow along perfectly. Not me. I was terribly missing Pox's information. But also, I do think that while the build is tanky as hell and does pretty good damage, playing other builds made me realize just how passive the RFJug is. It's kinda slow and a little wonky to be just rubbing up against bosses, throwing traps every so often. I've also been able to find other builds that are great for new players to learn, but just don't have as many resources as the RFJug. But still, it's one of the best new player tutorial builds in the game, hands down. Another massive shout out to Pox for his work on the build guide. What's up everyone, my name is AllTradesJack and I used to be a Path of Exile casual player. I have spent 550 hours learning this game, with only the last 150 or so being with a build guide. So you could say I have about 150 hours of true, relevant Path of Exile game time under my belt and 400 hours of confusion. I've given my critiques, both positive and negative, on the new player experience, but now that I've played this much, I think it's about time I start to talk about things that intermediate players run into. Things all players will experience once they hit tier 14 to 16 maps or so. Things like unique farming and the currency system. There's a lot I want to say, so let's get right into my not so casual, not hardcore, not so new player, not veteran, very intermediate mid-core review of Path of Exile. Overall, Path of Exile is quite possibly one of the best games I have ever played. It's not my favorite game of all time, but it's definitely near the top of the list. Of course, I'm gonna have my strong critiques, but I can't deny that every time I think I'm burnt out and want to quit PoE and uninstall it completely, I can't go through with it. I think about what's next. I think about another build I want to try, or another boss I want to see. Maybe this time I'll go as far as I can in the Delve mechanic, or figure out these Einhar beasts. Path of Exile is infuriating, it's demoralizing, it's terrible for new players, and the content bloat keeps the endgame successes well out of reach of anyone who can't truly dedicate themselves to and educate themselves on the game. But it's also incredibly rewarding. Path of Exile is high-intensity ARPG fun with critical thinking and character building as its main feature. The possibilities are endless and the learning never stops. It's a game that you need to take your time on, because there is a high probability that you could get burnt out. There's no point in speeding through all the content without enjoying the journey, because you may never reach the end of the game anyway. My favorite thing about Path of Exile is that I could play years on end and still be experiencing new things. It humbles you. It forces you to enjoy your time playing instead of rushing to get to the newest and most difficult endgame content. You will get there, eventually. Just be patient. I still enjoy playing Path of Exile, and I haven't let my problems with the game take that away. In the past year, I've put more time into this game than any other, except maybe World of Warcraft, and there's a reason for that. I enjoy Path of Exile. The character building, the sense of accomplishment, the feeling of absolute power once a build starts to come together, the amazing music, the atmosphere and aesthetic of the dark, dreary world, the smooth combat that can be customized in thousands of different ways, the bosses and the intricate way that you earn the right to progress in the game. All of the praise I've given PoE over the last 6 videos still rings true today. But for this review, I want to focus on some new critiques. These are features of the game that have both positive and negative aspects to them. They are features that started to become more and more prevalent as I dove deeper and deeper into the game.
Path of Exile seems purposefully structured this way. The more I learned, the more doors opened to me, and once I went through that door, I realized that the room behind it was larger than I could comprehend. Each mechanic in Path of Exile is an expansion's worth of content, some of which could be classified as an entire game on its own, and that can be a good and bad thing. My first critique is that GGG has created a game that suffers heavily from content bloat. Path of Exile has been out for 10 years now, with many expansions and leagues releasing new content every 3 months or so. And I know I've said this before, but good lord, there's just so much to do in this game. For longtime players, it means that they can have an intricate web of content that never gets outdated or becomes useless. The game is fresh every season, with old mechanics still having value as new ones are added. But the flip side is that anyone trying to come in and try out the game is going to be bombarded with all of this content at once, and have to learn how each mechanic works with each other without having been taught the building blocks to the game first. What can be found in the delve mechanic that I can't find in the heist mechanic? What crafting recipes can I unveil that I can't find in different maps? What can I find in the temple incursions other than rooms of treasure, or is that just a mechanic to get a bunch of loot at once? The problem with this is that it seems like each league mechanic can heavily benefit your player power to the point where build guides expect you to use them in order to create an endgame viable build. For example, the Righteous Fire build expects you to get the Charisma Anoint, which I had no clue how to get. I didn't even know that you could anoint items until I randomly ran into Sister Cassia in the Blight mechanic. And at that point, I was only anointing rings, saw that it was just giving me modifiers to help with the Blight mechanic battles, so I completely wrote it off. Luckily, there is a ton of online help for the Righteous Fire build, so I was able to figure it out, but can you imagine trying to understand this on your own? And this isn't just a new player's problem, this affects everyone. The knowledge hike doesn't stop after you get to the endgame. In fact, it gets to be much more. The amount of effort it takes to navigate through all of these mechanics is far more than most gamers are willing to give. And I know, the answer that I and most PoE players would give to that statement is that it's okay that Path of Exile isn't for most players. Path of Exile is more of a niche game. It's not a small community, but it isn't for everyone, and that's okay. But here's where I personally ran into a bit of a dilemma. I don't make videos as a job, I don't do YouTube as my primary source of income. Actually, to be completely honest, I make very little off of YouTube. The reason I post videos is because I genuinely love making content, seeing the reaction you all have, and reading and responding to comments. Over the past year, Path of Exile has been one of my favorite games to make videos on because all of you beautiful viewers from the community have been so welcoming and have left comments helping me with my builds and generally discussing the game. But recently, I've been given a horizontal promotion at work, and the amount of free time I have has been cut down by a lot. And I've found that the time it takes to learn, grind, and play Path of Exile and continue to make meaningful progression is far more than I'm willing to spend most nights. I have to keep my daytime job. I want to keep making videos, and I want to play Path of Exile, but it's hard to do all three. It's not that I've stopped playing, it's just that my progression and achievements are becoming harder to complete with the limited amount of time I have to learn as I play. And the majority of that has to do with the fact that the game is extremely complicated, with so much intertwining content that you will continue to hit progression walls until you stop playing, study a guide, or God forbid figure it out on your own, and then do the work in the game to make it happen. I've had less and less time to do that, and it sucks because I really want to play the game. I really want to keep feeling that sense of accomplishment and reach parts of Path of Exile that I haven't seen yet, but as my responsibilities in life take away from my time to play, I am realizing that I may have just come into the game too late. And without the time I had as a younger man, I can't keep up with the sheer amount of knowledge I need in order to play. This is my real-life example of Path of Exile becoming too time-intensive for me to keep up with. This doesn't happen to everyone, but unfortunately, it has affected me, and has given me much more sympathy to new or casual players that are trying to play Path of Exile and progress further into the game. Now, I'm still dedicating more time to video games than most people. I still love making videos and playing Path of Exile, so I will continue to do so even if my IRL job demands more of me. But like I said, the content bloat and the time it takes to navigate through that content is definitely going to be a big topic of conversation when it comes to new or casual players. The amount of content may be an incredible journey, but it's also an extremely daunting task. The rest of my critiques are all sort of consequences of content bloat, so I felt it was only fitting that we started with that, but let's move on because I think it'd be good to talk about the currency system next. I'm going to be honest, so far I've heard that the currency system in Path of Exile is pretty polarizing. Some players like how diverse and complicated the currency system is. They feel it defines PoE's gameplay, and it drives a sense of accomplishment when you finally get the amount or type needed to make that last piece of your build or unlock some new feature. Others feel that the sheer number of currencies in itself is enough to drive people away. That having 73 basic currencies and 82 league currencies is an unlearnable mess by anyone who doesn't have thousands of hours to spend learning the game and all the league mechanics. I don't think it's as black and white as that. I personally feel that GGG needs to streamline some of the currencies once PoE 2 comes out. I mean, I assume they would, considering there'd be no league mechanics yet, but I also think that the currency system is part of what gives the game its longevity. It's confusing, but all the currency has a purpose, and that purpose has a value, and no matter how many leagues go by, the value will be the same. Path of Exile's currency system refers to every item in the game that you can spend to alter your character or item in some way. For example, if you want to change the color of the sockets on an item, you spend a chromatic orb. If you want to corrupt that item, you spend a Val orb. Then after it's corrupted, if you want to change the color of its sockets again, you need to spend tainted chromatic orbs. There are endless examples of this and an insane amount of currencies in the game. Before, when I said there were 73 basic currencies and 82 league currencies, there are actually more. I just didn't know if they should be classified as currency or not. Things like essences or divination cards. Are maps technically currency since you spend them like a ticket and are used upon entry? Regardless, there's a lot of currency in this game, and if you think they're all well explained and easy to use, well, you're wrong. These oils are part of a league mechanic where you fight the Blight with Sissy Cassie over here. There are 14 different oils, each with a different color and each with a different property that when mixed together can provide enchantments to a jewelry item to assist in your Blight encounters. Each pair has a different outcome when combined, which means there are over 100 combinations to use. That does not include the combinations you can use on an amulet. On an amulet, you can use 3 oils to get an enchantment that provides a passive skill tree node. Thanks to the wiki for doing the math for me, that is over 455 combinations of oils, each with a different outcome. This is one of the biggest examples in the game of there being too much content to learn without a guide. How would anyone know which oils to use to get a specific passive skill? Which of the 455 combinations would give you the specific passive skill you need for your build? I don't want to get too far off topic. I've already talked about the issue of content bloat and how complicated these things can be, but this is just one part of the currency system in the game. And it goes back to the idea that every piece of currency has a purpose, so none of the currency you loot is useless. The upside is that Path of Exile will never run into the problem of inflation like games with a singular currency have. In Path of Exile, currency will always serve the same purpose and economical factors won't make it worth more or less, unless GGG changes the value of the entire mechanic it's part of. Even then, a Scroll of Wisdom will always identify an item, no matter how many new items come into the game. An Orb of Regret will always give you a passive skill refund point, no matter how many changes to the skill tree there are. I think this is really underrated as a concept, and I can't speak more highly of it. My biggest gripe with the currency system is that there is simply too much of it. For me, it goes hand in hand with the problem of content bloat. Too much has been added over time and has created an overabundance of complicated currency items. And not only is it entirely confusing, but you need so much of it to do anything substantial in the endgame. Like most modern ARPGs, currency is the single most important thing in Path of Exile, as pretty much everything about your character, your build, and your ability to access content relies on spending currency. And for the most part, I hadn't really had any problem with that until I got to tier 16 maps. My Righteous Fire build got to the point where I needed to get my 6-link chess piece set up in order to get a high enough DPS and survivability to beat some of these bosses. I didn't have a 6-link chess piece, so the first thing I did was look up how to get the 6-link recipe. It took me a while. I grinded different maps and the delve mechanic to try and get the 6-link recipe, and eventually I found it. I was beyond excited until I saw how much it cost to craft. 1,500 orbs of fusing to link a 6-socket item. Fuck! I understand that 6-link items are supposed to be hard to come by, I do, but geez. In all my time playing this season, I've only been able to save around 450 to 500 fusings. Farming is extremely time consuming, and trading with other players for currencies is an entire adventure on its own. And let me just remind you that if I were to get my 6-socket item, spend the 1500 fusings to link the sockets, spend the I don't know how many chromatic orbs to change the socket colors to the ones I need, all that currency is gone. So if in the next map I find a better combination of stats on a chess piece, I would have to do that all over again to get a new 6-link. I'm sorry, but for me, that is just too much. I've played MMORPGs my entire life, and This is a level of grind that even I don't care for. Even though I've gotten to this point in the game without really having a problem with the currency system, I have now been shown the true progression wall in the endgame, the expensive crafting progression wall, and the inevitability of the PoE grind. Grinding in Path of Exile is an exponential growth curve. The further you get into the game, the more grinding is required to maintain your progression. Currency farming, leveling to 100, unique farming, maps, invitations, soul vessels for the Pantheon, looking for all these different splinters, divination cards, soul fight for the delve mechanic, and contracts for the heist mechanic. Everything in Path of Exile requires some sort of item farming, and that takes time. Not just a little time, by the way, a lot of time. If it's easy to find, it's either extremely easy to run out of, or not important enough to be rare. And if it's hard to find, you'll spend multiple hours grinding for it, guaranteed. Taking the previous example of the currency system, the time it takes to find 1500 orbs of fusing is insane. I know it probably gets easier as you start modifying maps, getting to 20% quality and all the different influences and other stuff, but I'm finding it hard to even reach the point where I can do that. And remember, I'm following a build guide. I know I say this a lot, but can you imagine how painful this is to someone who's trying to play PoE without a build guide? Every mistake you make in your build may cost you days worth of game time played. Just like every other critique I have, the absolute monstrous grind that PoE introduces has two sides to it. The upside is that the crazy amount of work that goes into completing anything really boosts that sense of accomplishment. The feeling of satisfaction that you get when you finally get that combination of stats you were looking for, or finally have enough currency to craft something special, is only that much sweeter because of how much effort you had to put in to get it. The downside is that it's a lot of work. It's repetitive, you deal with a lot of RNG and the luck of loot drops, and if you aren't on the good side of the RNG gods, it could take days of game time before you get what you're working for. In my case, in addition to the 1500 orbs of fusing, I've been trying to get 3 different uniques to drop. These are uniques that Pox's Righteous Fire build calls for, and it would boost my survivability and damage immensely. I've gotten one of them, the other 2 I've continued to search for. I don't know exactly how to boost my chances, other than completing harder content with larger amounts of enemies, so I just keep at it. Keep completing maps, run delves, just try to get as much loot to drop as I possibly can, and it can be frustrating to know that I have no idea how much longer it will take for these uniques to drop. This is the mentality that you might have with a lot of things once you get this far. I need a specific item, I need a specific map with a certain modifier, I need the blight mechanic to show up so I can keep working towards these oils, and I need specific oils to drop. All of this takes time and the willpower to grind. Unless you want to trade, of course, the grind can be lessened by trading with other players, and to be honest, that's another thing that seems to be pretty controversial in the community. Some people love how trade works and don't mind that the majority of it happens outside the game. Others don't really care for it. I think I've made my opinion pretty clear in recent videos that I don't necessarily like that it's so far removed from the game, especially when grinds this intense put a heavy importance on player-to-player trading. But getting back to the topic of the PoE grind, I think it's a lot to ask of someone coming in for the first time. Someone who is learning and being punished severely for every mistake they make. Trying to get to level 100? Well, don't die, because you'll lose hours worth of XP that you'll have to get back. Trying to make that perfect build? Don't waste your currency on items that you may replace, because you'll just have to craft again later on. But also, don't be too weak that you can't progress in content. Again, I will say that the PoE grind is still somewhat okay in my book, because it means that the game provides me something to work towards no matter how many hours I put in. It's constantly giving me hard work, but it's also constantly giving me a hefty payout. And others who play will just have to ask the same question to themselves. Is the work I'm putting in worth the reward I'm getting? Alright, obviously there is so much Path of Exile to talk about once you get to tier 16 maps and beyond, but I think I'll save the majority of that for when I get a bit further. I can give better perspective on things. But one thing is certain, every season I am getting further and further into the game. I understand more than I did 3 months ago, and honestly, that's all I can ask for. I've enjoyed my journey so far, and no matter what critiques I may have, that enjoyment will never go away. But now I turn the mic over to you. I would love to hear all the opinions of the PoE community on the parts of the game that I talked about in this video. I may be done with this season, but I'm looking forward to whatever content PoE brings in the next one. So leave your comments on how you feel about my critiques, give me your perspective, and just for fun, tell me what builds you're looking forward to trying in the next season. Most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoyed your adventures into the Sanctum, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next. So I think this was a little bit controversial when I said this in the video, but I do think that Path of Exile suffers from content bloat. I do want to clarify now though, it's not that having so much content is bad, it's that having so much content and not being able to properly explain it is. One of the examples I use in the video are the oils for the blight mechanic. How would you know which combination of oils you should use to get the anointment you're looking for? Well, one beautiful viewer in the comments helped me and pointed me towards the skill tree where you can press Alt on the node to show which oils you need to combine in order to anoint that skill. How would I naturally run into this? Of course, the answer that we PoE veterans have is that you should look it up in a build guide or on the wiki, but I'll counter that argument with this. You don't know what you don't know. And I think the content bloat issue is that players who haven't been around to grow with the game are going to be left behind because there isn't much help to get them up to speed on some of those tips and tricks that veterans have learned over the years. The only way that you would have known to press Alt on a passive skill node is if you looked it up on a Reddit post or build guide or someone else in the community told you. There doesn't really seem to be a logical or natural way to get to that conclusion. Overall, still love PoE, but I do think that there is something to be said about how much content there is and how there really isn't an easy way to learn things. But PoE is not alone in this problem. We are getting to the point where there are plenty of games with decades worth of content updates shoved into one experience. World of Warcraft is my go-to example for this.
I decided that after 600 hours of refusing to trade in PoE, I was going to give it a shot. Not because I wanted to, but because after playing the game without it and trying to stubbornly progress further with less than optimal gear, I decided I would rather trade than beat my skull into my keyboard. In all seriousness, I just didn't have the time to play PoE like that anymore. I wanted to progress, but I didn't have hundreds of hours to leave up to RNG. So for this video, I want to talk about the concept of trade in PoE. Trade as a mechanic that is only about 25% in-game. The rest is on the official trade site PoE Trade. Let's get right into it because even after seeing how easy it is to trade once you learn about it, I quickly got bored and frustrated with trading in PoE. Buying things is the easier one, so I'll explain how to do that first. To buy an item, you need to go to the official trade site and search for it either using the exact name if it's a unique item, or using the filter system to look for rare or non-unique items. After searching for and finding the item you want at the price you want, you check to see if the player is online, click the Direct Whisper button which connects to your in-game character to automatically send the seller a message, you wait to see if the seller is available and wants to sell to you. If they do want to take the time to sell to you, they will invite you to a party, at which point you travel to their hideout and accept the trade request. Look at the item to make sure they aren't scamming you, and then put in the currency that you owe. Boom, sale complete. Make sure you say thank you and return to your hideout to sit alone and think about if that purchase was actually a good use of your time and currency. Now for selling items, it gets a little bit more tricky. Or maybe not tricky, just inconvenient. In order to sell items in Path of Exile, you need to first buy a premium stash tab. You can buy one new or upgrade one of your current tabs. Then you mark it as public and name it something cool, and now you have your sales bank. But before I go any further, if you're asking yourself, wait, did I just pay $5 for 50 points, of which I spent 40 on a new premium stash tab? You'd be correct, you just did that. If someone wanted to say that Path of Exile is pay to win, this would be their strongest evidence. Doesn't matter how much it is, you still need to pay to access trade. And as I'll get into later, you realistically cannot play Path of Exile in a meaningful way unless you trade. But okay, you've opened up your wallet to get the premium stash tab and now you can sell items. Place the item you want to sell in the premium stash tab and right click on it to set a price. Then you click this check mark and your item will automatically make its way through the worldwide interwebs onto the official PoE trade site, where some lucky person will see it and want to buy it from you. Whenever that happens, if it ever happens, you'll get a whisper message at which point you invite them to your party, they'll come to your hideout, and then you trade them the item for whatever price you ask for. At a first glance, this isn't that bad. Yeah, it's kind of a long process to set up and learn the first time, but once you do, it's fairly simple. And regardless of anything else I complain about in this video, it works. There is nothing wrong with it functionally. Good, keep thinking that. Just engage with the game, go with the flow, and enjoy all the intricacies and inconveniences because that's just the way it is, bro. Or, instead of being okay with this, you could take things one step further, one level deeper, and ask, why does trade have to be this way? Why does it have to be inconvenient? Why is it not in the game with an auction house? What if we could trade and play the game at the same time? At a minimum, what if there was a black market dealer NPC that you could click on and it would bring up the PoE trade site? I haven't really gotten a feel for the community's thoughts on trade yet. Some of the comments on my older videos say that trade isn't that bad and people like to complain. Others say that trade is annoying and terribly inconvenient as a way to handle player-to-player interactions. Though both sides agree that GGG just doesn't care enough to address trade in any way. They are totally okay with trade being this way, and there are no plans to make it easier or more convenient to use.
And I think that's my biggest problem with PoE trade. It's just unnecessarily inconvenient for a part of the game that is so necessary. Yes, trade is necessary. I don't think I can capture the absolute magnitude of difference between playing solo self-found and playing with trade. Playing solo is like trying to play basketball for the first time and you're playing against LeBron James. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, if you don't have the mastery and a deep understanding of the game, if you haven't practiced basketball over years and years of your life, LeBron will kick your ass. I'm exaggerating a bit, solo self-found is fun in its own way, but don't expect to be able to keep progressing without hundreds of hours of grinding and dying. Solo self-found requires you to use your game awareness and intelligence, along with a healthy dose of luck, to reduce the amount of time spent looking for an item upgrade. Yes, I will agree that the feeling of satisfaction you get when that item upgrade finally drops is insanely amazing, but it also doesn't happen that much. More often than not, you're just doing the best you can with the items that drop for you, and that is something only the pros can get away with. For us normal people, you aren't going to be doing uber bosses with random drops. Trade opens up parts of the game that were previously inaccessible. In a way, it offers the same benefit as following a build guide does. It allows you to focus on other things and have fun playing the game, knowing that no matter what you're doing or how much you don't know the game, you can still progress towards your goal. The easiest way to understand the benefit of trade is this. You can now quantify your time spent playing, at least more so than you could without trade. Completing repetitive maps, delves, and heists is more beneficial now, because all the trash items that have no use to your build may be worth something to someone else using a different build. So you pick it up, sell it, and now you have more currency to spend on something that is important to your build. That time wasn't wasted just because the RNG gods weren't on your side, you still received currency for your time playing. It's not guaranteed, you still could get shit drops, but it just accelerates the pace at which you can create your build and progress in the game. And buying things is so easy once you have an efficient way to get currency. Of course, it doesn't feel as good as finding it yourself, but the fact that it saves you hundreds of hours of grinding may just be worth it. But I think most of the PoE community knows that trade is the single most important mechanic of the game, so now I want to explain how inconvenient trading is. First things first, if you want to trade, you're not doing anything else. You aren't running maps while your items sit on sale and you make passive income. You aren't setting up your heist or looking at the delve map. You are in your hideout trading. To buy something, you have to scroll through the PoE trade site and wait for someone to answer you. You have to have your currency in your inventory, you have to travel to the buyer's hideout, and you have to manually accept the trade and then resume what you were doing before. To sell, you basically have to do the same thing, wait for someone to message you, and then stop whatever you're doing to go back to your hideout and manually sell your item. I don't know if other people feel this way, but after the novelty of trade wore off, I started to get extremely annoyed at how many times I had to go back to my hideout to sell my items to people who messaged me during one of my heists or delves or maps. If I was fighting a boss, that sale just wouldn't happen, because I'm not going to pause the boss fight, go back to my hideout to trade, and then press unpause on the boss fight. It doesn't matter if you can do it, because you technically can, I just don't want to. So I lost a bunch of sales just because I was busy and didn't want to leave the run I was currently doing. Why the hell would I want to leave my map to sell an item for one Chaos Orb? And it's the same experience to buy an item. To buy something, I have to take myself out of the game and just buy. This is annoying. It's a broken experience. Not only that, but if this was any other game, I feel like it would be against the terms of service or something. Think of it this way. The way you buy items in this game is to go to a separate website, scroll through a player-to-player market controlled entirely by players, and then meet up in-game to make the transaction. This is how most players in other genres go around the terms of service and sell things for real money. It's kind of funny that in Path of Exile, this is just considered the norm. Now, obviously, this isn't a malicious site or anything. You aren't paying for things in real money. I'm just trying to make the point that having trade outside the game is an anomaly, not the norm. Another thing I'm not too much a fan of is the fact that you have to go search on PoE Trade to come up with a price for the item you want to sell, unless you have the Awakened PoE Trade add-on created by the community. What a shocker that there's another add-on used to fulfill a need that the game does not. This add-on will tell you in-game what the price is for an item as long as you have it in your inventory. Again, something so simple that would take GGG no time at all to do, and they could probably do it a little bit better and it wouldn't require a GitHub download. Not to take anything away from the people who made this add-on, this is awesome. It's just annoying that we have to use this instead of having the functionality in the game. The last thing I'll mention is that trading doesn't make understanding the game any easier. In fact, it gives me a reason to just forget about the other mechanics because I don't need to learn them. I can just buy whatever item I was looking for. For example, in order to buy the 6th link that my build is telling me to buy, I need to have 4 divines. That's the price the player economy has set. Okay, that's fine. It makes perfect sense in the context of, here's an item, this is the price.
Other than the fact that I know how to spend money, there's not a lot of information here that I know about the transaction. I haven't really earned the item, so I don't really know its worth in the world. I don't know where the item comes from or how rare it is, only that it costs 4 divines. And I don't really know the value of 4 divines, other than it seems like they don't drop very often and are given value by the player base, so I guess they're important. I never really had to use one, and I'm kind of scared to do that now, because crafting is inefficient, and I'd rather just save currency and buy things. I don't think it's necessary to have trade explain things to you, but I do feel that trade made every other mechanic completely worthless. Why should I do anything in the game anymore other than constantly farm currency? It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, trade makes progression easier and gives you access to items you may never find. On the other hand, trade takes away the sense of accomplishment you get from progressing and getting that item, because you didn't do anything but buy it from someone else that earned it, or at least found it somewhere in their maps. Anyway, I think I've made my stance on trading pretty clear. It's necessary but annoyingly inconvenient to take part in. It's kind of outdated. This is an online game. We have the ability to trade in-game, and GGG should have the ability to make cross-server auction houses or something similar so that people don't have to remove themselves from the game in order to buy or sell an item. As it stands right now, you have to choose. If you are not actively trading, then you are actively not trading. And you know what? I get it. You might be thinking, it seems so basic, so petty of a complaint, but again, I ask you to remember, this is a game. One that is constantly in development, constantly releasing new seasonal mechanics, new microtransactions, balancing and rebalancing stats, skills, and items. Why can't we ask for a bit more convenience here? Why do we as the players just have to accept what is given to us when our microtransactions are the reason the game is continuing to do so well? Yes, buying this stupid cute lantern bear is the reason Chris Wilson is able to lead a fulfilling life and do what he loves. Ask for more. Path of Exile doesn't need to be complicated and inconvenient. It can just be complicated and we can all be happy. Comment below with your opinions on trade. I really do want to hear what you all think of the trading system as it is, why you think it hasn't changed so much over the years, or why you think it's better this way, and changing it would actually make the game worse. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you are enjoying your Crucible weapons so far, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next. I still can't tell if I like the way trade is handled or not, but one thing I can say is that in the video I mentioned that GGG doesn't care about trade, which, as I was told in the comments section, isn't entirely true. The trade manifesto that GGG posted some time ago was brought to my attention. In it is an explanation as to why they keep trade the way it is. In short, user friction keeps trade from being the optimal route for players to gain power. Now, of course, this is their game, and GGG knows way more about PoE than I do, so I can't really argue with them on it. But a part of me disagrees with their reasoning. I can get into my disagreement another time, but in short, my argument is that trade seems to only create friction for those unwilling to engage with the trade system. And most veterans or top players already engage with trade. In fact, it seems like most of the game is built around the idea that you can spend currency to get items. The ones who are hurt in this case are the new or casual players who don't understand the game well enough to engage with trade in a meaningful way. New or casual players won't download a price add-on. They won't understand currencies or loot value. They won't want to navigate through trade sites to engage with a terribly inconvenient trade system. Dedicated players would definitely do all that. So, in my mind, it's the new and casual players who get the short stick here. Not to mention that the loot in the game and the amount of currencies you need to do anything seems like it's all balanced around trade being the best way to acquire the equipment you need. Or at least it does for the mid-game portion where the most new and casual players would burn out. Anyway, not trying to open up another can of worms, but once again, I am sorry that I said GGG doesn't care. They obviously do. This was a conscious decision on their part to try and keep the game mechanics working in a certain way. Just because I may disagree with them doesn't mean they don't have a reason to do what they're doing. Alright, and we're all caught up to the present. If you got this far, I want to thank you one more time for watching my videos, and I hope you comment on this one so I can thank you individually. I've mentioned this a couple times before, but I don't do YouTube for money. I am definitely not popular enough to do that. I make videos and post them because it's fun to have my work critiqued and to have conversations with you all on games that I play. And I do feel incredibly grateful for the community that I'm a part of. Going forward, I'm hoping to try out the new PoE League in a month. I've been reviewing other games recently, so take a look at those if you have some time. And I truly can't wait to see more on PoE 2. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy your adventures in Rayclast, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.